Hello everyone and welcome back to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep, and I'm here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. The air was crisp and cool, the kind of late October weather that wraps around you like a thin, unseen blanket, chilling but not unbearable. It was my first vacation in months, and I had been looking forward to some peace and quiet. Life in the city had a way of pressing down on you, grinding away any sense of clarity or stillness. Between long hours at work and the constant hum of traffic, I felt like I was suffocating. So when my childhood friend, Liam, suggested a weekend hike in a forested area not too far from our hometown, I jumped at the chance. Liam and I had grown up together in a small rural town where the forests were like our playgrounds. We used to spend our summers exploring the trails, pretending to be adventurers mapping uncharted territories. It had been years since I'd last set foot in those woods, and the idea of revisiting that part of my past filled me with an odd sense of comfort. We decided on a patch of forest about 30 miles from the outskirts of town. It wasn't one of those popular, touristy hiking spots with neatly paved trails and helpful signs. This place was raw and untamed, the kind of place where your phone lost signal within minutes of entering. Liam assured me he knew the area well. He had been hiking it for years. I trusted him. After all, we'd been navigating woods together since we were kids. That morning, we loaded up his old SUV with backpacks, water bottles, and enough snacks to last a small army. I packed my favorite thermos of coffee, a thick woolen jacket, and my well-worn hiking boots. I even threw in a small notebook, thinking I might jot down some thoughts or sketches along the way. It felt good to have a plan, even if it was just a simple walk through the trees. When we arrived, the forest greeted us with an almost eerie silence. There were no other cars in the small gravel lot, just ours. A narrow dirt path disappeared into the towering pines, their branches forming a natural archway that seemed to swallow the sunlight. Liam looked over at me with a grin that bordered on mischievous. "Feels like old times, huh?" he said, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. I nodded, trying to ignore the faint knot in my stomach. I told myself it was just nerves, the kind that came from stepping into unfamiliar territory. We had the entire day ahead of us, and I wasn't going to let some silly apprehension ruin it. The first mile or so was uneventful, even enjoyable. The forest floor was a mix of damp earth and fallen leaves, their vibrant reds and oranges muted under the dense canopy. We talked about everything and nothing: work, old friends, our childhood antics. Liam led the way, occasionally pointing out a tree or rock formation he claimed to recognize. As we ventured deeper, the forest seemed to change. The trees grew taller, their trunks thicker, and the undergrowth became more tangled. The air felt heavier, carrying a faint, almost metallic scent that I couldn't quite place. It wasn't unpleasant, just odd. Around noon, we stopped for a break near a small stream. I sat on a flat rock, pouring coffee from my thermos and watching the water trickle over smooth stones. Liam pulled out a map, a faded, hand-drawn thing that looked more like a relic than a reliable guide. "How accurate is that thing?" I asked, smirking as I sipped my coffee. "More accurate than you'd think," he replied, tracing a line with his finger. "We're here, and if we keep going this way, there's a clearing with a great view of the valley." It all sounded fine in theory, but there was an annoying sensation in the back of my mind, like I was missing something. Still, I didn't voice my doubts. Instead, I shrugged, finished my coffee, and followed Liam back onto the trail. The afternoon stretched on, the sun dipping lower in the sky. The forest seemed quieter now, the occasional rustle of leaves or chirp of a bird growing less frequent. My legs were starting to ache, but Liam was insistent that we were close to the clearing. "Just a little further," he said, glancing back at me. I wanted to believe him, but the trees seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being swallowed whole, like the forest was a living thing, closing in around us. By the time we realized we hadn't seen the clearing or any recognizable landmarks in hours, the sun had slipped behind the horizon, leaving us in the dim, gray light of dusk. "Do you have a flashlight?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Liam nodded, pulling a small, battered one from his pack. He clicked it on, the weak beam barely piercing the growing darkness. "Let's keep moving," he said, his voice quieter now. I didn't argue. I just followed him, my hands shoved into my jacket pockets, my eyes scanning the shadows between the trees. The trail had vanished, or at least that's how it felt. We were walking in what should have been the direction of the clearing Liam had described, but every step seemed to lead us deeper into the forest's endless maze of trees. The faint glow of his flashlight barely cut through the shadows, illuminating only the patch of ground directly in front of us. I glanced down at my watch, 6:48 p.m. "Are we even on the map anymore?" I asked, trying to mask the growing unease in my voice. Liam stopped, pulling out his map again and unfolding it under the shaky light of the flashlight. He frowned, tracing his finger over the worn paper. "We should have reached the clearing by now. Maybe we veered off a bit, but it's not far." He said it like he believed it, but I could hear the doubt creeping into his tone. Something about his posture was different too. His usual confidence seemed to falter. "Maybe we should just head back," I suggested, trying to keep the edge of tension from cracking through my words. Liam nodded reluctantly. "Yeah, let's retrace our steps." But as we turned around and began walking, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The path behind us didn't look the same. It should have been familiar, but the trees seemed denser, the terrain uneven and unfamiliar. I kept my thoughts to myself, not wanting to make the situation worse, but I could tell Liam was noticing it too. We pressed on, the silence around us growing heavier with each passing minute. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes with peace. It was oppressive, almost unnatural. The usual sounds of the forest, chirping crickets, rustling leaves, were absent. The only noises were the crunch of our boots on the forest floor and the occasional snap of a twig. Then it happened. The first strange thing. We were about 20 minutes into our attempt to backtrack when Liam suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I froze, my ears straining. At first, there was nothing, just the same suffocating quiet that had been following us. But then, faint and distant, I heard it a soft, rhythmic sound. It wasn't loud enough to be clear, but it was distinct. "It's probably just an animal," I said quickly, trying to reassure both of us. Liam didn't look convinced. "That doesn't sound like an animal," he muttered. The sound came again, a little closer this time. It wasn't footsteps, but it wasn't entirely unlike them either. It had a cadence to it, deliberate and steady. My skin prickled as the realization set in. Whatever it was, it wasn't random. "Let's keep moving," Liam said, his voice tense now. We picked up our pace, the flashlight beam bouncing erratically with each hurried step. But the sound persisted, following us, always just far enough away that we couldn't see its source. "Do you think it's another hiker?" I asked, though even as I said it, I knew it didn't feel right. "Maybe," Liam said, but his tone suggested he didn't believe it either. The rhythmic noise grew louder as we walked. It wasn't constant. It would stop for a moment, then start again, as if whoever or whatever was making it was pausing to listen. Liam stopped abruptly, spinning around to shine the flashlight behind us. The beam swept through the trees, revealing nothing but trunks and shadows. "Hello?" he called out, his voice sharp and authoritative. No response. The sound stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that felt worse than the noise itself. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. "Liam, let's just keep going," I said, my voice shaking now. He nodded, and we turned back toward what we hoped was the direction of the parking lot. But the forest wasn't done with us. As we moved, the flashlight flickered. Just once at first, like the bulb was loose. Liam smacked it against his palm, and the beam steadied. But then it flickered again, this time longer, plunging us into brief but suffocating darkness before flaring back to life. "Great," Liam muttered, smacking it harder. "Maybe it's the batteries," I offered, though I wasn't sure if I was trying to convince him or myself. The light flickered again, and for a split second, in the faint glow before it went out completely, I thought I saw something. A shape vague and indistinct just beyond the edge of the flashlight's reach. It wasn't an animal, it was too tall, too still. But before I could process what I'd seen, the light came back, and it was gone. "Liam," I said quietly, "I think." A sharp crack of a branch snapping nearby cut me off. Liam swung the flashlight toward the sound, the beam jittery and weak. "Who's there?" he demanded. The forest gave no answer, but I could feel the weight of something watching us. "Liam," I whispered, "we need to leave. Now." He didn't argue. We broke into a hurried walk, almost a jog, the flashlight's beam growing dimmer with each passing minute. The sound, whatever it was, had stopped, but the sense of being watched hadn't. It clung to us like a heavy fog, pressing down and making every breath feel shallow. I glanced behind us once, and though I didn't see anything, I could have sworn I felt eyes on me, unseen but undeniable. By the time we finally stopped to catch our breath, we were both on edge. Liam crouched down, his hands on his knees, breathing heavily. "This doesn't make sense," he said, his voice shaking. "I know this forest. I know these trails. Maybe we're just turned around," I offered weakly. But deep down, I didn't believe that. Something wasn't right here, something beyond just getting lost. As we stood there, trying to gather our bearings, the forest seemed to close in even tighter around us. The trees felt impossibly tall, their branches weaving together to block out the night sky. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the faint metallic scent I'd noticed earlier was stronger now. "Liam," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "I think we're being followed." He didn't respond right away, but his expression told me he'd been thinking the same thing. The unease that had been bubbling beneath the surface began to boil over as we pressed deeper into the forest, still desperate to find our way out. Liam's flashlight was on its last legs, the beam flickering so erratically it was barely useful. I held my phone in my hand, but its flashlight was weak, a pale imitation of the one Liam carried. Still, we didn't dare stop. The path, or whatever path we thought we were on, was unrecognizable. The dense underbrush clawed at our ankles, and the once loamy ground had turned uneven and rocky, forcing us to stumble as we moved. The oppressive silence of earlier had been replaced by an unsettling cacophony. Faint rustles, distant creaks, and what sounded like a low hum of voices just beyond the reach of our hearing. At first, we ignored the noises, chalking them up to the forest waking up for the night. But as they grew louder and more persistent, they became impossible to ignore. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice shaking. Liam nodded, his jaw tight. "Yeah, it's getting closer." The sounds weren't random. They seemed deliberate footsteps that stopped when we stopped, whispers that faded just as we tried to focus on them. The forest seemed alive, aware of us in a way that was unnatural. We stopped to catch our breath near a massive oak tree, its gnarled branches twisting like frozen lightning against the faint glow of the moon. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and sour that made my stomach churn. Liam pulled out his map again, but the paper was useless now, crumpled and smeared with dirt. "This doesn't make any sense," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "We should have been back hours ago." I didn't respond. My eyes were fixed on the darkness beyond the edge of the flashlight's reach. For the first time, I felt certain we weren't alone. "Liam," I said quietly, "something's out there." He looked up at me, his expression a mix of frustration and fear. "What are you talking about?" "I saw something earlier, when the flashlight flickered." I didn't want to say anything because I wasn't sure, but now I trailed off, my throat tightening. Liam opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a sound cut through the night, a low, guttural noise that froze the blood in my veins. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't human either. It was something in between, a distorted, primal growl that seemed to reverberate through the trees. We both froze, our eyes wide and our breathing shallow. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on the forest floor. Liam grabbed my arm. "We need to move. Now." We took off running, not caring about direction anymore, just desperate to put distance between us and whatever was out there. The flashlight's beam bounced wildly, illuminating flashes of trees and underbrush. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but adrenaline pushed me forward. The growl came again, louder and more menacing, followed by the sound of branches snapping. Whatever it was fast, and it was following us. We stumbled into a small clearing, the first open space we'd seen in what felt like hours. In the center was a weathered stone, covered in moss and etched with strange markings. The sight of it stopped us in our tracks. "What the hell is that?" Liam whispered, his voice trembling. The markings were intricate, swirling patterns that seemed almost alive in the faint light. I couldn't read them, but they felt wrong, like they didn't belong here or anywhere. "Liam," I said, my voice barely audible, "we shouldn't be here." Before he could respond, the growl came again, so close it seemed to vibrate through the air. We turned toward the sound, and for the first time, we saw it, or at least part of it. A shadowy figure stood at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the flashlight's beam. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs elongated and distorted. Its eyes, if they were eyes, glowed faintly, reflecting the weak light like a predator's. Liam raised the flashlight, his hands shaking, but the beam flickered and died, plunging us into darkness. I grabbed his arm, my voice trembling. "Run!" We bolted, crashing through the underbrush, with no regard for the noise we made. Branches whipped against my face and arms, leaving stinging welts, but I didn't care. All I could think about was getting as far away as possible. The sounds of pursuit were relentless, heavy footsteps, snapping branches, and that guttural growl, now almost a roar. It wasn't just following us, it was hunting us. We stumbled into another clearing, smaller this time, and collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. My chest heaved, and my heart felt like it was going to explode. "Liam," I panted. "What? What do we do?" He didn't answer right away, his eyes scanning the darkness. "We need to figure out what this thing is," he said finally, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "Are you insane?" I snapped. "We need to get out of here." "And go where?" He shot back. "We're lost. If we don't figure this out, we're dead." Reluctantly, I nodded. He was right. We couldn't keep running blindly. We stood there in silence, listening to the night. The growls and footsteps had stopped, but the oppressive sense of being watched hadn't. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for us to make a move. Liam picked up a branch from the ground, testing its weight. "If it comes back, we fight," he said, though the fear in his voice betrayed his bravado. I grabbed a rock, my hands trembling. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. For what felt like an eternity, we stood there, weapons in hand, waiting for the next attack. The air was thick with tension, every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig setting us on edge. But nothing came. The forest seemed to retreat, the oppressive presence lifting slightly. It was almost worse than the pursuit. The silence felt like a cruel game, as if whatever was out there was toying with us. "Liam," I whispered, "what if it's still out there, watching us?" He didn't answer, but the look on his face said everything. We didn't sleep that night. We sat back to back in the clearing, our makeshift weapons in hand, waiting for the next sound, the next sign of movement. The forest, silent for what felt like hours, erupted into chaos without warning. It started with a single, low growl deeper than before, vibrating through the clearing and rattling my chest. The sound was so primal, so visceral, that it felt like the very ground trembled in response. Liam stood abruptly, his makeshift club gripped tightly in his hands. I followed suit, clutching the sharp-edged rock I had picked up earlier. My heart pounded so violently I could hear it in my ears, drowning out everything except the sounds of our ragged breathing. The growl shifted into something more sinister, a guttural, almost human moan. Then came the footsteps. They were deliberate, heavy, and impossibly slow, as if whatever was approaching knew there was no need to hurry. "Liam," I whispered, barely able to keep my voice steady. "It's coming." "I know," he muttered, his knuckles white as he tightened his grip on the branch. "Stay close." The darkness around us seemed to deepen, the faint light of the moon swallowed up by the encroaching shadows. And then it stepped into view. At first, I thought it was another trick of the light, some cruel illusion conjured by my exhausted mind. But as the figure moved closer, its form became horrifyingly clear. Its eyes glowed faintly, two pinpoints of pale, flickering light that seemed to pierce through the darkness and into my very soul. The mouth was worse, a grotesque, jagged gash that stretched too wide, filled with teeth that seemed to glint even in the dim light. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. My mind screamed at me to run, to do anything, but my body refused to listen. Liam, to his credit, didn't freeze. With a roar that was equal parts fear and defiance, he charged at the creature, swinging the branch with all his strength. "Get back," he shouted, the sound echoing through the clearing. The branch connected with the creature's arm, but it didn't react the way it should have. There was no grunt of pain, no stagger backward. Instead, it tilted its head, as if curious, and reached out with one impossibly long arm. The hand closed around Liam's wrist with horrifying ease. He screamed a sound that would haunt me forever, and dropped the branch as the creature lifted him off the ground. "Liam!" I shouted, finally breaking free from my paralysis. Without thinking, I hurled the rock in my hand at the creature's head. The rock struck true, hitting it just above one glowing eye. It let out a sound that was somewhere between a snarl and a screech, a noise so inhuman it made my blood run cold. The creature dropped Liam, who crumpled to the ground, clutching his wrist and gasping in pain. I ran to his side, pulling him up as quickly as I could. "We have to go," I shouted, my voice cracking. Liam nodded, his face pale and twisted with pain, and together we stumbled back into the forest, away from the clearing and the nightmare that waited there. But the creature didn't let us go so easily. The growls started again, louder and more menacing, accompanied by the sound of those deliberate, heavy footsteps. It was following us, and it was faster than before. Branches tore at our clothes and skin as we ran, the uneven ground threatening to trip us with every step. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they might give out, but the sheer terror propelling me forward was stronger than any physical pain. "Liam," I gasped, "we can't keep running. We need to hide." He nodded, glancing around wildly, before pointing to a cluster of boulders partially hidden by dense underbrush. "There," he panted. "It's our only chance." We scrambled toward the boulders, squeezing into the narrow space between them. It was a tight fit, and the jagged rocks dug into my back, but it offered a small measure of concealment. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just beyond our hiding spot. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensed as I prayed the creature wouldn't find us. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and I could hear the low, guttural breathing of whatever was out there. Liam gripped my arm, his eyes wide with terror. He mouthed something, but I couldn't make it out. And then it spoke. The voice was a grotesque mockery of human speech, deep and gravelly, with an unnatural cadence that made my skin crawl. "Why? Do you run?" It rasped, the words hanging in the air like a toxic cloud. I bit down on my lip to keep from screaming, the taste of blood flooding my mouth. The creature moved closer, its shadow falling across the boulders. For a terrifying moment, I thought it would find us. But then it stopped, tilting its head as if listening to something only it could hear. And just like that, it was gone. The footsteps receded into the distance, and the oppressive presence lifted slightly. But the relief was short-lived. "We can't stay here," Liam whispered, his voice barely audible. I nodded, my hands trembling as I helped him to his feet. The forest was eerily quiet as we moved, every shadow and sound a potential threat. My mind raced with questions. What was that thing? Why was it after us? And most importantly, how were we going to survive? We moved in silence, the weight of what we had just experienced hanging heavily in the air. The forest, once so familiar, now felt like a maze, twisting and turning with every step. My eyes constantly darted to the shadows, each one seeming darker than the last, each rustling sound growing more menacing. Liam's limp was slowing us down. I could see the pain on his face with every step, his hand clutching his injured wrist. I knew we couldn't keep running like this for much longer. We had to find somewhere safe, somewhere we could regroup. But where? How far do you think we've come? I asked quietly, my voice almost drowned out by the rustling of the trees around us. I don't know, Liam replied, his voice hoarse. Too far to turn back. We need to keep moving forward. His words, though practical, filled me with dread. How could we possibly move forward when we didn't even know where we were? The creature was still out there, lurking in the forest, and I had no idea if it was following us or if it had already moved on. We had no map, no compass, only the instinct to survive. The sense of direction was as unreliable as the ground beneath our feet. And as much as I hated to admit it, I wasn't sure if we could make it out of here alive. The thought of that thing, that grotesque creature, still haunted me. Its twisted form and those glowing eyes etched into my mind like a permanent scar. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still close, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I turned to Liam, trying to gauge his condition. Sweat dripped down his face, and his eyes were clouded with exhaustion. He wasn't going to make it much longer if we didn't find shelter. "We need to stop," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We can't keep going like this." Liam nodded, but I could see the hesitation in his eyes, the fear of stopping and being caught. It was the same fear that gripped me. But we had no choice. We found a small clearing, partially hidden by thick underbrush. The trees around us provided a bit of cover, and the ground was relatively flat. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. Liam collapsed onto the ground, his breathing labored. I sat next to him, my back against a tree, and for a long time, we just sat there, doing nothing but listening. The forest was unnervingly quiet now. No sounds of distant animals, no rustling leaves. Just the occasional wind whispering through the trees, carrying with it the smell of damp earth and decay. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I don't know what that thing was," Liam said, breaking the silence. His voice trembled slightly, and I could tell he was struggling to keep it together. "What do you think it was?" "I don't know," I replied, my own voice thick with fear. "It wasn't human. It couldn't have been. But what was it?" Liam's eyes were distant, his gaze unfocused, as if trying to make sense of it all. "Do you think it's still out there, following us?" "I don't know," I repeated, unable to offer him any reassurance. "I don't even know what it wants." The weight of the unknown was unbearable. It was one thing to run from something you understood, an animal, a threat you could comprehend. But this was something else entirely. Something I didn't have the words for. We sat in silence again, the tension between us thick and suffocating. The hours stretched on. Liam eventually managed to fall into an uneasy sleep, his head resting against the base of the tree. I, however, couldn't bring myself to close my eyes. My mind kept racing, replaying the events of the night, the creature's eyes, its voice, its movements. Nothing made sense. The minutes seemed to drag on forever, and as much as I wanted to fall asleep, I knew I couldn't let my guard down. Not yet. Not until we were out of this nightmare. But then, something changed. I could feel it in the air. The forest seemed to come alive again, though this time, It wasn't the calm of nature. No, it was a strange, oppressive feeling. The temperature dropped, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my heartbeat quickened. Something was approaching. I stood up quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. I shook Liam away, my hand gripping his shoulder urgently. "Liam, we have to go. Now," I hissed. He bolted upright, his face pale with fear. "What? What's happening?" "I don't know, but I can feel it. It's coming." We didn't wait another second. I grabbed his arm, pulling him to his feet as we stumbled out of the clearing and back into the dark forest. I didn't care where we were going anymore. I just needed to put as much distance between us and whatever was stalking us. As we ran, I could hear the sounds of movement behind us, faint at first, but growing louder. It was unmistakable, the heavy, deliberate footsteps. The creature was still out there, tracking us, and it was closer than ever. The panic surged through me again. It was real. The threat wasn't just in our minds. We weren't alone. The forest was alive with something malevolent, something that wanted us. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the sound stopped. The footsteps disappeared. We stopped, gasping for breath, trying to make sense of what was happening. But there was nothing. No growl, no movement, just the eerie silence of the forest. Liam and I exchanged a look, our eyes filled with the same question. Had it gone? I didn't know. We stayed still for what felt like hours, listening, waiting for the next move, the next sign that we were still being hunted. But nothing came. The forest was silent again. It was then that I realized the creature had gone. It had stopped chasing us. The terror we had felt, the undeniable sense that we were being hunted, had faded. But what did that mean? Did it leave us alone? Or was it simply biding its time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? We had no answers, only the quiet, the darkness, and the unshakable feeling that we had narrowly escaped something far worse than we could ever understand. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. As we continued through the forest, the quiet that enveloped us became unbearable. The tension was still thick, but now it was different, less frantic, more resigned. The creature, whatever it was, had disappeared without a trace. There was no sign of its presence, no eerie footsteps, no chilling growls or whispers in the wind. But as much as I wanted to believe we were safe, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was watching us. We made our way through the trees, the dense underbrush scraping against our legs, until we reached a small creek. The sound of running water, for the first time since we'd entered the forest, felt like a relief. I didn't know where we were, but the presence of the creek meant we were near some kind of path, or at least a natural landmark. It was a small hope, a sliver of reassurance in an otherwise overwhelming uncertainty. I glanced over at Liam, who was moving slower now, his face pale and drawn. The injury to his wrist was taking its toll, but it was his eyes that told the real story. They were hollow, as if the terror had drained him of more than just physical energy. We had both seen something in those woods, something that defied reason, and it had left its mark. "Do you think we'll make it out?" Liam asked quietly, his voice still heavy with the weight of everything we'd been through. "I mean, I keep thinking, what if that thing is still out there, just waiting for us to slip up?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "But right now, we need to keep moving." The creek led us to an old dirt road, weathered and overgrown with weeds. It wasn't much, but it was a sign that we were closer to civilization. The road twisted through the trees, and we followed it, taking comfort in the simple fact that we were headed somewhere anywhere other than the forest. The road seemed to stretch on forever, the trees growing thicker around us as we moved deeper into the woods. I had no idea how much longer we walked, only that the forest had a way of swallowing time. The familiar sounds of nature were starting to return, the calls of birds, the rustling of leaves in the wind, but it all felt too distant, too disconnected from the nightmare we had just lived through. Finally, after what felt like hours, we saw the lights of a distant town flickering through the trees. It was a welcome sight, but at the same time, It filled me with an unsettling realization. What would we tell them? What could we say? No one would believe us. No one would understand the horror we had experienced. And even if they did, what good would it do? We had barely escaped with our lives, and the thought of reliving it, of trying to explain it, felt like an additional burden I wasn't ready to carry. The town came closer, the streets more defined, the houses growing larger and more numerous. We made our way down the road until we finally reached the edge of the woods, where the pavement met the first row of homes. The noise of the town people talking, cars driving by, was a jarring contrast to the silence we just left behind. Liam and I stood there for a moment, staring at the town, both of us unsure of what to do next. Should we go to the police? Liam asked. I shook my head. What would we tell them? That we were chased by something in the woods? Something that wasn't human? Liam looked down, his face shadowed with doubt. Then what do we do? I took a deep breath. We move on. We go home, and we try to forget about all of this. But we know the truth. We know what happened, and maybe that's enough. The decision to leave it all behind wasn't easy, but I knew it was the only choice we had. The memories would stay with us, haunting us in our quiet moments, but for our own sanity, we had to move forward. We couldn't let fear control our lives any longer. As we walked into the town, the normalcy of it all felt surreal. The streetlights, the cars passing by it, all felt like it belonged to a different world, a world where strange creatures didn't lurk in the shadows. It felt like we had returned to reality, but something inside me knew that the truth was different. The truth was far darker than anyone could ever imagine. I glanced at Liam, who was still limping slightly, his face tired but determined. He didn't look back at the forest. Neither of us did. We kept walking, and though I knew the road ahead would never be the same, I also knew there was no turning back. The year was 2012. It was an ordinary night like any other. I had just finished a long day of work, and the exhaustion from my 9-to-5 job weighed heavily on my shoulders. The sky had darkened as I stepped out of the office building, the usual hum of city life buzzing in the background. The air felt thick with the heat of the summer, but the city lights illuminated the streets as they always did. I had decided to take the late-night train home, knowing that the quiet of the evening would give me the perfect chance to unwind and rest. Little did I know that this routine train ride would be anything but ordinary. I stood on the platform, waiting for the train that would take me home. The sounds of distant chatter and the rhythmic clatter of passing cars filled the space. Around me, commuters hustled to catch their own trains, all of us following the same predictable pattern. Go to work, go home, repeat. But as I glanced around, I noticed something odd. It was the kind of feeling you get when you're suddenly aware that something in your environment doesn't quite feel right. It wasn't immediately alarming, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up for reasons I couldn't explain. The train, when it arrived, was almost too quiet, as though it had just materialized out of thin air. No announcements blared from the speakers. No voices echoed over the intercom. The doors opened with a soft hiss, and I stepped aboard, as I always did. The interior of the train was dimly lit, casting long shadows across the empty seats. A few people occupied the train. None of them looked particularly out of place, but there was something unsettling about the stillness of it all. The train didn't seem to be moving at a usual pace either. It felt sluggish, as if it was dragging itself forward rather than gliding smoothly down the tracks. I walked down the aisle, choosing a seat near the window. As I sat, I looked around, trying to push away the strange sense of unease creeping into my chest. Everything about the ride felt off, but I couldn't pinpoint exactly why. I attributed it to being tired, chalking it up to the exhaustion that had built up over the week. It was a typical night for the most part until it wasn't. There was an unsettling absence of conversation. Normally, the train would be filled with quiet murmurs of tired commuters or the occasional laughter of a late-night reveler. But tonight, the silence was oppressive. It wasn't the kind of silence you'd expect from a late train. No, this felt different. It was as if the very air around me had been sucked out, leaving only an eerie stillness. I glanced around at the other passengers. Most of them were staring blankly out of their windows, their faces illuminated by the dull glow of the overhead lights. I shifted in my seat, trying to make myself more comfortable, but it was as if the train had a mind of its own, shifting and creaking in unnatural ways. The sound of the wheels grinding against the track echoed in the cabin, but it was hollow, devoid of the usual rhythm I had become accustomed to. I began to wonder if it was the late hour that made everything feel so off-kilter. Surely, it wasn't anything unusual. I had ridden the same train countless times before, at even later hours. But tonight was different. Tonight, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept my eyes on the passing lights outside the train, watching as the city whizzed by in a blur. Yet, despite the speed at which we traveled, the scenery outside seemed wrong. The familiar landmarks were distorted, as if the train were passing through a warped version of the city I knew so well. Buildings that should have been in one place seemed to appear out of nowhere, and streets I recognized felt twisted and unfamiliar. The lights from the streets outside flickered in strange patterns, as though they were trying to tell me something, but I couldn't quite decipher what. I tried to calm myself, thinking that my mind was just playing tricks on me. It wasn't uncommon to feel disoriented after a long day of work, especially on a train that had seen better days. The fatigue must have been messing with my perception. Yet, despite my attempts to reason with myself, the feeling only intensified. The silence in the train grew heavier, and I noticed that the other passengers, if you could call them that, hadn't moved. They were all sitting in the exact same position, not once adjusting their posture or even blinking. It was as if they were frozen in time, locked in place by something beyond my comprehension. I started to wonder if I was the only one who felt the oddity of the moment. As the train continued on its way, I began to feel the weight of my own breath. It sounded louder, more pronounced, and the air inside the cabin felt stifling. Each exhale felt like an effort, each breath filling my lungs with a strange, metallic taste that I couldn't place. I tried to focus on the rhythmic sway of the train, hoping it would calm me down, but instead, it only made everything seem worse. The swaying of the train felt unnatural, now jerky and erratic, as though the vehicle itself was fighting to move. As I sat there, my heart racing, I couldn't help but wonder, was I the only one who felt it? Was it just me, or had something gone terribly wrong? I don't know how long I had been sitting there, staring out of the window, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Time had lost its usual meaning in that cramped, dimly lit train car. The silence seemed to stretch on indefinitely. The disorienting images outside blurred by city streets that weren't familiar, people I hadn't seen before, shadows that shouldn't have been there. I was beginning to wonder if it was all just fatigue, maybe a result of the long hours at work, but deep down, I knew that something was wrong. As I sat in that motionless stillness, I noticed the other passengers more keenly. They hadn't moved since I had boarded. Not a single one of them seemed to shift in their seats, blink, or even breathe. It was as if they were all statues, frozen in place, and that thought began to settle heavily in my chest. I felt the overwhelming need to shake myself out of the creeping panic, but no matter how I tried to reason with myself, the unsettling atmosphere wouldn't go away. Then, something small happened, something subtle that could easily have been overlooked if you weren't paying close attention. I was gazing at the dimly lit tunnel that had just swallowed the train as it passed through an underground section of the city, when I felt a faint, almost imperceptible movement in the corner of my eye. It was on the opposite side of the train, a figure. The strange thing was, the figure hadn't been there a moment before. There was no one standing by the door when I boarded. I was sure of it. I turned my head slightly, trying to catch a better glimpse, but in the half-light of the cabin, I couldn't make out much. The figure, whether it was real or a trick of the light, seemed to be standing at the far end of the car, near the emergency exit. It was barely visible, obscured by the shadowy corners of the train. I squinted, trying to focus on it, but just as I thought I could make out a shape, the figure seemed to flicker, as if it was there 1 second and gone. The next! At first, I chalked it up to my tired eyes. I rubbed my face, trying to clear the fogginess. But when I looked again, the figure was still there. It was almost as if the figure was waiting for something or someone. I couldn't explain it, but the feeling was chilling. My hands started to sweat, and I quickly glanced around at the other passengers, hoping someone else had seen what I had. But no one reacted. They just sat there, unmoving, like they hadn't noticed a thing. I felt my pulse quicken. Was it me? Was I the one seeing things? Or had something gone wrong with the train? I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the longer I stared at that shadowy figure, the more it seemed to shift. The outlines of it would distort and blur, like a mirage that refused to come into focus. My breathing grew heavier, and I quickly looked back down at my hands, gripping the armrest of my seat tightly. The train continued its slow, rhythmic movement, but I couldn't shake the sense of being watched. It wasn't a feeling I was used to, but it gnawed at me, creeping under my skin like a cold, silent pressure. I took a deep breath and decided to take a walk through the train to calm myself down. I needed to get away from that figure, or whatever it was. As I got up, I noticed something strange. The air around me felt thicker. There was a heaviness in the cabin now, a weight in the atmosphere that had not been there before. I had been on trains late at night, many times in fact, but I had never felt the air like this stifling and unnatural. The sound of my footsteps felt too loud, echoing unnervingly across the metal floor as I walked toward the back of the car. It was as I passed by the emergency exit where I had seen the figure that I froze. The door, which had been firmly closed when I got on, was now slightly ajar. Just a crack, enough to see a sliver of darkness beyond. But what was most unsettling was the faint sound that now emanated from that space. It was a low, almost imperceptible hum, like the faint buzzing of electricity or static from an old television screen. I couldn't place it, but it made my heart pound in my chest. I stopped in my tracks, not sure if I should push the door open further or just walk away. My mind raced with thoughts, trying to explain away what I was hearing, what I was feeling. It could be a malfunction, I told myself. Something with the train systems. But even as I thought it, a deeper sense of dread settled over me. That buzzing sound. It wasn't right. A brief, sharp gust of wind blew through the crack in the door, and I instinctively stepped back, startled by the sudden chill. I stared at the door for a few more seconds, unable to move. My body felt rooted to the spot, my legs refusing to carry me away. Something was wrong. I didn't know how to explain it, but deep inside, I knew I wasn't just tired anymore. I wasn't imagining things. I turned around and looked back at the other passengers. Not one of them had moved. They remained frozen, their faces pale and expressionless. The silence in the car was deafening. And then, something else happened. The lights flickered. It wasn't the usual flicker of an old bulb. This flicker felt deliberate, almost rhythmic. The overhead lights dimmed, then flashed brightly, before returning to their usual state. A sharp, cold chill ran down my spine, and I instinctively reached out, grasping the nearest pole for support. My heart raced and my mind spun. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't bring myself to move. As the lights flickered again, I heard the sound of footsteps coming from the back of the train, slow, deliberate footsteps that echoed louder with each passing second. They weren't the usual shuffle of tired commuters. These steps were heavy, purposeful. The footsteps grew closer and closer, and I found myself frozen, unable to turn around to look. The temperature seemed to drop even further. The warmth of the summer night had disappeared entirely. The air felt frigid, unnatural. And then I heard a soft, guttural whisper coming from behind me. "Don't look." It was faint, so faint that I wasn't sure if I had heard it at all. But my body tensed. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to run, but something held me there, paralyzed with fear. I glanced around again. The passengers, the train, everything, it felt so wrong. But when I turned my gaze back toward the emergency exit door, the shadow was gone. It vanished without a trace, leaving nothing behind but the faint buzz of the broken, malfunctioning lights. I turned quickly, my pulse racing, and hurried back to my seat, ignoring the heavy footsteps and the chilling whisper. As I collapsed into the seat, I glanced nervously around the cabin, my eyes searching for any sign of what had just happened. But there was nothing, just the silent passengers and the low hum of the train as it trudged on into the night. But I knew something had just happened, something I couldn't explain, and whatever it was far from over. I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that had settled deep in my chest. The train, now traveling further into the night, seemed to be pulling me into a space that felt more like a nightmare than reality. I could still hear the faint hum of the malfunctioning lights, the eerie whispers that seemed to flicker in and out of my awareness. I tried to tell myself that it was just my mind playing tricks, that the stress of work had gotten to me. But the feeling in my gut said otherwise. The other passengers remained still, almost too still. It was as though they were part of the scenery, frozen in time, locked in a world that didn't belong to me. I glanced around nervously, but no one looked back. No one acknowledged the strange tension hanging in the air. The stillness was suffocating, and every minute that passed felt like an eternity. Each step I took toward the back of the train seemed to take me deeper into the unknown, further away from the safety I thought I had. I found myself instinctively walking the length of the car again, but this time with more purpose. My eyes darted from one dark corner to another, searching for any sign of movement, of something out of place. The lights above flickered again, casting shadows across the narrow aisle, making everything appear as if it were part of a dream I desperately wanted to wake up from. But the cold air, now thick and heavy, told me I wasn't asleep. This was real. Too real. The distant hum of the malfunctioning lights was now joined by something else. The unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. Slow, methodical, unhurried. At first, I tried to tell myself it was just someone else on the train, perhaps another passenger walking down the aisle. But when I turned to look, there was no one. The footsteps continued, and my heart began to pound in my chest. The sound echoed in the stillness, each step sending a jolt of panic through me. I walked faster, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, and glanced over my shoulder again, expecting to see someone or something behind me. But still, there was nothing. The footsteps, however, did not stop. They followed me, eerily in sync with my own movements, growing louder and louder. I could feel the sweat forming on my palms as I gripped the armrest of my seat tighter. I could no longer ignore it. Something was happening. Something I didn't understand. Something I couldn't explain. The train was no longer a familiar space. It had become a prison. Every creak of the metal, every flicker of the lights, every slight shift in the air felt like it was part of something bigger, something darker. I approached the emergency exit again. The door that had been ajar earlier seemed to be standing more open now, the gap wider than before. There was no logical reason for this. I hadn't seen anyone pass through. The door had been firmly shut when I first boarded. Yet now, it seemed to invite me in. The flickering lights above cast eerie shadows that danced around the edges of the doorway, making it seem as though something or someone was hiding just beyond. The buzzing sound, faint but unmistakable, was growing stronger. My chest tightened with dread as I reached for the door handle. As my hand made contact with the cold metal, I felt a jolt of energy, like static electricity. My fingers tingled, and I immediately pulled my hand back. It was as though the door was alive, reacting to my presence. I hesitated for a moment, my heart hammering in my chest. Should I open it? What if I found something I wasn't supposed to see? But I had come this far. I couldn't turn back now. I took a deep breath and forced myself to push the door open. The sound of the hinges creaking echoed loudly in the otherwise silent train, the only sound piercing through the thick air. The moment the door cracked open, a rush of cold air hit me, sending a chill through my entire body. The darkness beyond was suffocating, and the faint buzzing sound intensified. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw the figure standing just outside the door. The figure wasn't human, not exactly. It was tall, impossibly tall, its shape distorted in the low light. It was not quite solid, not quite transparent, but somewhere in between, flickering like a malfunctioning light bulb. It wasn't even the figure itself that made my stomach churn. It was the fact that it was standing in the open air, in a place where the train should have been. There was nothing beyond the door, just blackness, a vast emptiness that seemed to swallow everything whole. My breath caught in my throat, and I stepped back, my mind racing. What was I looking at? What was this thing? My instincts screamed for me to run, to get away, but my legs refused to move. I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. It didn't move. It just stood there, still, as if it were waiting for something. A sudden, sharp noise broke the silence. It was the sound of a door slamming shut, somewhere in the distance. I spun around, my pulse quickening. Was it a passenger? Had someone else heard the same things I had? My eyes darted frantically around the train car, searching for any sign of movement. The other passengers remained seated, as still as they had been since the beginning. It was like they were in a trance, unaware of everything going on around them. And then I saw something else. A flicker in the corner of my vision, another figure, closer this time. I could barely make out its features in the dim light, but it was there, just beyond my peripheral vision. Another one, and another. They were multiplying, appearing from the shadows, filling the space with their strange, shifting forms. They seemed to move in perfect synchrony, as if they were one entity, one being with many faces. The fear that gripped me now was unlike anything I had ever experienced. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. My body was frozen, trapped in this nightmarish scenario. Each figure that appeared brought with it a feeling of dread that gnawed at my very core. I knew then that I couldn't ignore it any longer. I couldn't deny what was happening. This wasn't just a broken train. It wasn't just a glitch in the system. Something was terribly wrong. I turned toward the other end of the train, hoping to find an escape, but the sight before me stopped me in my tracks. The train car, which had once seemed so familiar, had changed. The walls were closing in, the ceiling lowering, and the windows now revealed nothing but a void. The very air felt thick, suffocating, and I could hear the whispering again, this time louder, more urgent, as though the voices were all around me. I had to get out. I had to find a way to break free from whatever had taken hold of this place. But no matter where I looked, there was no escape. The train had become a labyrinth, a prison with no way out. The shadows were closing in, and the figures, now dozens strong, were stepping closer. I wasn't alone anymore, and whatever they weren't going to let me go. The air inside the train had become unbearable. It wasn't just the crushing heat that enveloped me or the suffocating silence that lingered like a heavy fog. It was the feeling that something was watching, something was moving, shifting in the dark corners, closing in on me. I could feel it in my bones, a deep, primal fear that sent tremors through my body. The train car, once just a compartment of metal and seats, now felt like a living thing, breathing, pulsating with an energy I couldn't understand. I stumbled backward, my heart racing in my chest, my legs trembling as if they were no longer my own. Every step I took seemed to pull me deeper into the nightmare. The figures, those strange, flickering forms, had surrounded me, their presence growing more intense with each passing second. They moved with an unsettling fluidity, never stopping, never blinking, just existing in a space that felt impossible to comprehend. The buzzing sound had intensified to a deafening hum, reverberating through my skull like a swarm of bees, yet the train itself was silent. The other passengers remained motionless, as if they were unaware of everything happening around them. My breath caught in my throat as one of the figures reached out toward me. It was taller than any human could be, and its hands stretched unnaturally long, fingers thin and elongated, reaching for me with a chilling, deliberate slowness. I froze, unable to move, as if my body had forgotten how to function in the face of true terror. The air grew colder with every inch the figure advanced. Its skin was a pale, translucent shade, as though it were made of nothing more than fog and shadows. Its face, if you could even call it that, was a blur of indistinct features, shifting and contorting as though it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Then, it spoke. The voice was not like anything I had ever heard. It wasn't human, no, it was something far worse. The sound was a distortion of whispers, layered on top of each other, echoing from every direction, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was a voice that spoke to something deep inside me, something primal, something that had no place in the world of reason. "Why? Are you here?" it asked, its voice echoing in my skull. "Why? Did you come?" The words didn't make sense, and yet they were somehow the only thing that seemed to matter. I wanted to speak, to answer, but my voice was trapped. My throat constricted, and I could barely breathe, let alone form words. I could only stare, transfixed by the figure's otherworldly presence. I backed away, my feet stumbling as I tried to put distance between myself and the thing before me, but it followed. It wasn't just the one figure now. The others, dozens, maybe hundreds, had begun to converge on me. The train, the walls, the windows, they were all gone. All that remained was the darkness, the oppressive weight of the void pressing in from all sides. Suddenly, the lights flickered one last time, and in that split second of darkness, I saw it. The figure, the one that had been closest to me, was no longer flickering. It was solid, flesh, bone. It stood in front of me, its twisted form now fully realized in the dim light. Its face was no longer a blur, it was my own face, staring back at me, twisted and warped, like a reflection in a shattered mirror. The shock hit me like a physical blow. My stomach churned, my blood ran cold, and my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. It was me. It looked like me. But it wasn't. It was wrong. It had the same eyes, the same nose, the same mouth, but its expression was twisted into something grotesque, a mockery of my own features. And its smile, it wasn't a smile at all. It was a sneer, full of malice and cruelty. Its eyes, dark and hollow, gleamed with an unsettling knowing, as though it had been waiting for me all along. "Do you know why you're here?" the figure asked, its voice now my voice, but hollow, distorted. "You came looking for something, but what you found was never meant for you." The words echoed in my mind, repeating over and over like a curse. And in that moment, I realized something. I wasn't just trapped on a train. I wasn't just lost in a nightmare. I had been here before. Everything, the flickering lights, the strange figures, the cold air, it was all part of something bigger. Something ancient. Something that had been waiting for me, watching me, long before I had boarded the train. I turned, desperate to flee, but there was nowhere to go. The train, the walls, the seats, they were all gone, replaced by an endless void that stretched out before me, swallowing everything in its path. The figures, all of them, were now moving in sync, a collective force, drawing closer and closer until they surrounded me entirely. I could feel their cold hands on my skin, their eyes staring into my soul. The last thing I heard before everything went black was the voice. My voice. One final whisper. "You never should have come." The darkness that followed was suffocating. I don't know how much time passed. Minutes? Hours? Days? Time seemed to lose all meaning in the void. The figures around me faded into the background, their presence still felt, but no longer tangible. The cold air, the oppressive weight, it all seemed to dissipate, leaving only a silence so profound that it was almost deafening. When I finally opened my eyes, I was no longer on the train. I was standing in a room, a small, dimly lit space. The walls were covered in cracks, and the air smelled of decay and dust. It was a room I didn't recognize, a room that felt unfamiliar, yet somehow old, as if it had been here for centuries, forgotten by time itself. I tried to move, but my legs were weak, and I stumbled as I made my way to the door. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the walls pressing in from all sides. My heart pounded in my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own breath. I stepped forward, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. When I turned it, the door opened, and I was met with an endless corridor. The same void, the same emptiness. But now I knew what it was. I knew what had happened. I wasn't just lost. I wasn't just trapped. I had crossed over. I had entered a place between worlds, a place where time and reality no longer held sway. And as I stepped into the corridor, I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I was never going to leave. I had to leave. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to get out of the hallway, to escape whatever twisted, inhuman force had dragged me into this place. But no matter how hard I tried, my legs felt like lead, my breath shallow and labored, as if the very atmosphere was intent on holding me in place. The hallway stretched before me, endless, and yet somehow it felt as though I was walking in circles. Each step I took felt heavier than the last, my feet dragging against the worn, cold floor, as though the earth itself were trying to pull me back. I wasn't sure if I was still on the train, or if I had been transported to some otherworldly dimension. The walls around me, cracked and worn, seemed to pulse with an eerie, rhythmic thrum, as though they were alive. My senses were overwhelmed. The silence that hung in the air was deafening, yet I could still hear the faint echo of my footsteps. The very fabric of reality seemed to distort around me, and my mind raced to make sense of it all. Where was I? What had happened to the other passengers? Were they still trapped on that train, or had they been consumed by whatever force had taken hold of me? My thoughts were clouded, like I was trying to think through a thick fog that wouldn't lift. The more I tried to make sense of it, the more I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. Then I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, there was a door. It wasn't like the others, solid, unyielding. It was illuminated, glowing faintly with a soft, inviting light. The contrast to the darkness around me was jarring. My heart skipped a beat as I moved toward it, drawn by something I couldn't explain. It was as though it held the promise of escape, the only thing that might return me to some semblance of normality. But the closer I got, the more I realized that something wasn't right. The door wasn't just glowing. It was humming, vibrating with a frequency that seemed to resonate deep within my chest. I felt a pull, a magnetic force that urged me forward, but at the same time, something inside me screamed to stop, to turn around and run. Every instinct told me that whatever was behind that door was not something I could face, but the desire to escape, to leave this nightmare behind, was too strong to ignore. I reached for the doorknob, my hand trembling, the cold metal sending a shock through my body. As I turned it, the door creaked open, revealing a space beyond it that was both familiar and strange. The room was dark, but I could make out the shape of a small, weathered desk in the center. A faint light flickered from an old lamp on the desk, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. There was a chair, too, and sitting in it there was someone. Someone who looked almost familiar. I didn't know how to explain it. They were dressed in a long, dark coat, their back to me, but I could tell that this person, whoever they were, held an eerie presence. I could feel it, like the air itself was charged with electricity. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise as they slowly turned toward me, their eyes locking onto mine. It was then that I realized it wasn't a person at all. It was a reflection. The figure in the chair, though lifelike, wasn't a living being. It was a mirror image of myself, distorted and warped in ways that defied all logic. The eyes that stared back at me weren't mine, yet they felt like they were. The face was twisted in a grotesque, silent mockery of my own, and the expression held nothing but emptiness, a cold, hollow stare that chilled me to my very core. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I was frozen, locked in place by the force of the image in front of me. My mind scrambled, racing to make sense of it all, but nothing fit. No explanation seemed to work. I didn't understand. Then, the figure spoke. "Do you understand now?" The voice was my own, but again, not my own. It was distorted, alien, like 1,000 whispers echoing from somewhere deep within the recesses of my mind. "Do you understand what you've done?" The words felt like a weight in my chest, heavy and suffocating. I couldn't speak. I could barely breathe as the image in front of me seemed to move, its features shifting as if trying to speak, to communicate something that I couldn't grasp. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the image vanished. I staggered back, my heart pounding in my ears, my thoughts scattered. The room, the hallway, everything seemed to warp around me, spinning out of control. I couldn't tell what was real anymore. The very air felt different, charged, unnatural. I stumbled toward the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my mind reeling from the encounter. I had to leave. I had to get out. I tore through the hallway, my legs moving on their own, propelled by sheer instinct. My surroundings blurred as I raced down the corridor, desperate to escape whatever nightmare I had found myself in. The door, the hallway, the shadows, they were all fading into the distance, until there was nothing but darkness around me. And then, silence. I don't know how long I wandered in the void. It felt like hours, or maybe days. The boundaries of time had dissolved, and I was left alone in a vast, empty nothingness. My thoughts were clouded, my body weak and drained. I didn't know if I was dreaming, hallucinating, or if I had truly crossed over into something beyond understanding. But then I saw a light. Not the faint, inviting glow of the door, but something different. A bright, blinding light, filling the entire space. I shielded my eyes as it grew brighter and brighter, until I couldn't see anything at all. The light enveloped me, and for a moment, I thought I might be consumed by it, swallowed whole. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light vanished. When I opened my eyes, I was back on the train. The cold metal of the train car felt grounding, solid. The rhythmic hum of the tracks beneath me was the only sound in the world. The other passengers sat motionless, unaware of the horrors I had just experienced. I was shaken, disoriented, my heart still racing in my chest, but everything appeared normal. Or at least, it seemed that way at first. The train was still moving, heading toward an unknown destination. But I knew now that I wasn't truly free. Something had followed me. Whatever it was, whatever I had encountered, it was still out there, lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting. I looked around, trying to make sense of everything. The people around me didn't seem to notice anything unusual. They were still asleep, still caught in their own routines, unaware of the nightmare I had just escaped. But I wasn't fooled. The world felt different now, like I had crossed a threshold, and no matter how hard I tried to convince myself otherwise, I knew I couldn't go back. Not truly. The train kept moving, its destination unknown. And somewhere, deep inside, I realized that I was still on the edge of something darker. Something I might never fully escape. It's strange, the way time works when you're living in a nightmare. The moments seem to stretch, bending into themselves, until you're no longer sure if what you're experiencing is real or just another twisted fragment of your mind. I thought the experience on that train was over, that I had escaped whatever dark force had ensnared me. But now, I wasn't so sure. It's been weeks since I left that station, weeks since I stumbled off the train into the cold, clear light of the real world. I've tried to resume my life, to return to some semblance of normalcy, but things aren't the same anymore. The world I see now feels detached, like I'm walking through a dream I can't wake up from. The sounds are muted, the colors dull, and every passing day feels like a step further away from the reality I once knew. I still have nightmares, horrible, visceral dreams that drag me back to that hallway, to the door, to the strange, distorted reflection of myself. In these dreams, I'm always running, always trying to escape something that I can never outrun. I've tried to stop sleeping, tried to fill the hours with distractions, but it doesn't matter. The nightmares come whether I close my eyes or not. But it's not just the dreams. It's the little things, the feeling that something is watching me, that I'm not truly alone. I'll be sitting in my apartment, staring out the window at the busy street below, when suddenly, the hairs on the back of my neck will stand up. My heart will race, and for a brief, fleeting moment, I'll see a figure in the reflection of the glass. Just a blur, but it's there, always there. Then it vanishes, leaving nothing behind but an unsettling emptiness. I've tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself that it's just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I know the truth. I know that whatever followed me off that train is still out there. It's waiting, it's watching, and no matter how far I run, no matter how hard I try to escape, I will never truly be free of it. It was never just a bad dream. It wasn't some figment of my imagination, some twisted illusion. It was real. It happened. And in some way, I feel like it's still happening, like I'm caught in some endless loop, unable to break free. I went to the station again, not out of curiosity, but out of a desperate need for answers. I stood in front of the same train, staring at the same cold metal doors. The station was busy, filled with people rushing to their destinations, just like before. The train seemed ordinary, like any other train, its passengers unaware of the horror I had experienced. But when I stepped inside, I felt that same suffocating presence, that same eerie weight that had pressed down on me the first time. I didn't get on. I couldn't. But I watched it leave, the train pulling away from the platform, its rhythmic clattering fading into the distance. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something in the window. A figure, sitting alone in the darkened car. It didn't move, didn't acknowledge me. But I knew it wasn't just another passenger. It was something else, something that had followed me back, something that would never let me go. And so, I'm left here, in this endless waiting. In the quiet moments, I still hear the hum of the train in the distance. And though I know it's not real, I can't shake the feeling that it's out there, somewhere, always moving, always just out of reach, waiting for me to get on again. Maybe I'll never truly escape. Maybe the nightmare is just beginning. I don't know what's real anymore. But if you're reading this, if you're hearing my story, just know one thing. You don't want to find out. Because once you do, once you step onto that train, there's no getting off. And when you reach the end of the line, you might find that you've crossed into something far darker than you could have ever imagined. It was the fall of 2018 when I first encountered the bridge. At that time, I was living in a small town tucked away in the Northeast, where the seasons felt more intense than anywhere else I'd ever lived. Winters were brutal, and summers seemed to last only for a moment. It was a town where people knew everyone's name, and the pace of life was slow and predictable. To be honest, I loved it. The simplicity, the sense of familiarity, it gave me a certain peace that I didn't realize I'd been craving. I'd been living in the town for about a year, working as a mechanic at a local garage. My days were spent in the grease and grime of engines, fixing cars, and helping out locals who were in need of repairs. The work wasn't glamorous, but it was honest, and the people I met were always down to earth. My friends were mostly the ones I worked with, good, reliable folks who would always have your back, especially if something went wrong. One friend, Tom, had grown up in this town, He had told me stories about the area's history and its legends. But one particular tale stuck with me, the legend of the old bridge that stood at the edge of the woods, about 5 miles from town. No one could really explain why, but it had a certain reputation. It wasn't talked about much, but if you ever found yourself there at night, the locals would always give you that look, the kind of look that said, "You know better," than to go near it. Tom, however, had never believed in the stories. He chalked them up to overactive imaginations and old folklore. We would often joke about it when we were hanging out after work, but there was always an underlying tension in the air when the topic came up. The bridge had an eerie presence that seemed to reach out and pull at the edges of your mind, even if you didn't believe in the supernatural. I first came across the bridge on one of those late-night drives home after working a shift at the garage. The moon was full, casting an otherworldly glow on the winding road that led out of town. It wasn't unusual to take this route, as it was a shortcut back to my house, but this time was different. As I rounded the corner that led to the bridge, I noticed something off in the distance. The bridge stood there, surrounded by thick trees that seemed to close in around it, as though it was being swallowed by the forest. I remember feeling a strange sensation as I neared it. A chill ran down my spine, not from the cold, but from the odd sense of foreboding that seemed to hang in the air. I couldn't explain it, but something didn't feel right. I told myself it was just the darkness, the quietness of the place, or maybe even the stories I'd heard. But it was more than that. It was as if the bridge itself was calling out to me, beckoning me forward. I drove over it that night, the headlights of my car casting long shadows across the wood and steel. The creak of the old structure beneath my tires seemed almost too loud, echoing in the still night. I didn't stop to linger. I just wanted to get across it as quickly as possible. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was out there, hidden just beyond the trees. The following day, I mentioned it to Tom at work. I joked about it at first, trying to laugh it off, but Tom's reaction was different from what I'd expected. He got quiet for a moment, his eyes looking far away as if lost in thought. He finally spoke, his voice low. "You felt it, didn't you?" he said. "Felt what?" I asked, still unsure of what he meant. "The bridge. It's not just a bridge. It's been around for a long time, and there are stories about it. People say strange things happen there, but no one talks about it. Not really." Tom paused before adding, "Just be careful if you ever go back." I laughed it off. "I'll be fine. It's just an old bridge, right?" Tom didn't say anything more on the subject, but his words lingered in my mind. The bridge wasn't just a bridge, it was something else. Something older, darker. I thought about it as I drove past it on my way home that evening. The way it stood there in the silence, waiting, and that feeling I couldn't shake, the one that made my skin crawl. It wasn't until a few weeks later, when I found myself heading back toward the bridge on another late-night drive, that I would begin to understand just how much of an impact that old structure had on me. Little did I know, that was only the beginning of what would soon become a terrifying experience. It had been a few weeks since I'd last crossed the bridge. Life had a way of getting in the way, and while I hadn't completely forgotten about that night, I had pushed the thought of it to the back of my mind. After all, I was a practical guy. There was no reason to let a few strange feelings get in the way of my normal routine. But as the autumn air grew colder and the leaves began to fall, I found myself driving home late once again, this time after a long day at the garage. The sun had long since set, and the roads were quiet. My headlights carved out a path through the thickening darkness as I cruised down the familiar route toward the bridge. It wasn't as if I'd been planning to go down that way. In fact, I had taken a different route, but somehow my car seemed to turn itself down the familiar path without me consciously deciding to do so. I didn't even realize it until I saw the bridge up ahead, looming in the distance. I told myself I was just being paranoid. It was just a bridge. I had driven over it many times before, and nothing had ever happened. Still, there was a strange pull, something deep inside me urging me to turn back, to go the long way around. But before I knew it, I was already heading toward it. As I got closer, I noticed that the night seemed unusually still. There wasn't a single sound, not even the rustling of the trees. The air was thick with silence, heavy, as if the entire world was holding its breath. My car's engine hummed softly, but it almost seemed too loud, too intrusive against the stillness. I reached the bridge and slowed my car as I approached it. I could see the faint outline of the wood and metal structure ahead, but something wasn't right. The way the shadows fell over the bridge seemed wrong. It was as if the darkness was consuming it, making it appear even more menacing than before. The feeling I had the first time I crossed the bridge, the one that I had tried to ignore, began creeping back into my chest. I started to drive over the bridge, the familiar creaking of the wood beneath my tires filling the silence. But then, as I neared the middle of the bridge, I heard something else. A faint sound, like the soft rustling of footsteps on the wood. I looked around, but there was no one in sight. My heart skipped a beat. I slowed down, scanning the area, my eyes darting from side to side. Nothing. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just the wind or some animal making its way through the forest. But even as I thought that, I could feel my grip tightening on the steering wheel. I didn't want to admit it, but I felt a presence. Something or someone was out there, watching, waiting. I quickly sped up and crossed the rest of the bridge without incident, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that had gripped me. Once I was safely across, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone standing at the other end of the bridge. But there was nothing, just the darkness and the trees. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding and kept driving. But as I made my way back into town, my mind was still racing. What had that sound been? Was it just my imagination, or was something really out there? The next day, I found myself talking to Tom again, though I didn't immediately bring up the bridge. We were in the garage, working on a truck, when Tom glanced at me and spoke. "You've been quiet lately," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Something on your mind?" I hesitated for a moment, not sure how to bring it up, but I knew I couldn't shake the feeling. I needed to talk about it. "I crossed the bridge again last night," I said, my voice low, "and I heard something." Tom looked up, his expression unreadable. "What kind of something?" "It sounded like footsteps," I said, still trying to make sense of it. But there was no one around. It was dead quiet, like nothing was moving except me. Tom's face darkened, and he gave me a serious look. "I told you there's something off about that bridge." I frowned. "I don't get it. It's just a bridge, right? Why would it be haunted or whatever?" Tom shook his head slowly, like he was debating whether or not to tell me more. After a long pause, he spoke again, his voice low. "People who go there at night sometimes hear things. They see things too. I've never told you the whole story, but there's more to it than you know." My curiosity piqued. I urged him to continue. "What do you mean?" Tom glanced around the garage, as if checking to make sure no one else was listening. Then he leaned in closer. "Back in the 80s, there was a group of kids who decided to dare each other to spend the night at the bridge. They were out there drinking, just messing around, when something happened. No one really knows what it was, but the next morning, only one of them came back. And he couldn't remember what had happened, but he said he saw something on the bridge, something not human. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up. Tom wasn't the type to tell stories like this, but the way he was speaking so serious, so matter of fact, told me he wasn't joking. He was just as unnerved by it as I was. "Has anyone else experienced something like that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Tom nodded grimly. "A few, but no one talks about it. People just avoid the bridge." I didn't know what to say. The thought of something or someone being out there, watching me, sent a chill down my spine. That night, after work, I found myself driving past the bridge again. I wasn't sure why, but I felt this strange compulsion to go back. My mind was racing with Tom's words, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something I was missing. something that was calling to me. This time, I didn't even try to avoid the bridge. I didn't hesitate or slow down. I drove straight toward it, determined to face whatever lay ahead. As I approached the bridge again, I noticed something different. The air felt thicker, colder. The trees seemed to press in closer, almost as if they were closing off the road. The bridge itself looked darker, more menacing. My car's headlights illuminated the planks, but they seemed to cast long, distorted shadows that flickered unnaturally. I stopped at the edge of the bridge, my breath coming faster now. It was almost as if the bridge itself was alive, pulsing with an energy I couldn't understand. And then, just as I was about to continue across, I saw a figure standing at the far end of the bridge. Tall, thin, and silhouetted against the night sky. My heart stopped in my chest. But as quickly as I saw it, the figure was gone. Disappeared into the shadows as if it had never been there at all. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. But the fear was still there, crawling up my spine. Something was out there. And whatever it was waiting for me. In the days following my second encounter with the bridge, something shifted in me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me home that night. A presence I couldn't see, but could definitely feel. My sleep had become restless, plagued by strange dreams of dark figures standing just beyond my reach, their faces obscured by shadows. I woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. But no matter how much I tried to shake the feeling, it clung to me like a cold fog. Every time I walked through the house, I couldn't shake the sensation that someone or something was watching me. The creaks of the floorboards in the hallway, the rustling of the curtains, even when there was no wind, it was all too much. The anxiety started to consume me. My mind became clouded with thoughts of the bridge, of the figure I had seen standing at the far end, and of Tom's warnings. And still, I couldn't help but feel drawn back to it. It was around this time that I started seeing strange things during my day-to-day life. Nothing too out of the ordinary at first, just small, unsettling occurrences. One evening, I was working on my truck in the garage when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside. My first instinct was to assume it was just the wind or a stray animal passing by. But then I remembered that there was no wind, no rustling of leaves, and the animals in the area usually stayed out of sight at this time of night. The footsteps seemed deliberate, heavy, as though someone was walking in slow, measured steps, and they were growing louder by the second. I dropped the wrench I was holding and rushed to the window. There was nothing, no one standing outside, no movement in the yard. I stepped outside, my heart racing, and looked around. The air felt thick, suffocating. The chill of the evening made the hairs on my neck stand up, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the empty night. I told myself I was just being paranoid. It was nothing. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just my imagination playing tricks on me. I had never felt so aware of my surroundings, as if everything had suddenly become too real, too vivid. The next day, Tom called me out of the blue. I hadn't spoken to him since our conversation about the bridge, but when I saw his name on my phone, a knot twisted in my stomach. I had a feeling he knew more about what was happening to me than I wanted to admit. "Hey, you good?" he asked when I picked up. "Yeah, just a little on edge," I replied, trying to sound casual, though I could feel the tension in my voice. "Why?" "I told you before, there's something weird about that bridge," he said, his voice unusually serious. "I don't think you're just imagining things. People have been feeling it for years. You need to stop going there." "I don't know if I can, Tom," I admitted. "It's like something's pulling me back to it. Every time I drive by, I just can't help myself. And lately, things have been getting weirder." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Tom spoke again, his tone was low, almost hesitant. "I've been hearing things too," he said. "Not just the usual stuff, footsteps, whispers, that kind of thing. People have been seeing figures. Not just at the bridge, but in town, too. It's like whatever's there. It's spreading." That's when it hit me. The strange occurrences, the unsettling sensations, the dreams, they weren't just in my head. It wasn't just the bridge. Something was following me, something connected to it. I needed to know more. I had to understand what was happening, or else I wouldn't be able to sleep, much less function. Later that evening, after dinner, I grabbed my flashlight and headed to Tom's place. He lived about 10 minutes away, a little cottage on the edge of town, far enough out that the only thing surrounding it was dense forest. He was sitting on his porch when I arrived, looking more tired than I'd ever seen him. "You're not going to like this," he said when I sat down beside him. "I don't care. I need to know what's going on," I replied. Tom nodded, looking down at the ground. "Okay, I'll tell you everything. But first, let me show you something." We got up and headed to his garage, a small building at the back of his property. Tom rummaged around in a drawer, then pulled out an old, tattered journal. The leather cover was worn and cracked, the pages yellowed with age. He handed it to me, and I opened it carefully, flipping through pages filled with handwritten notes, sketches, and odd symbols. "This belonged to my grandfather," Tom explained. "He was obsessed with the bridge. He said he could feel something watching him every time he went near it, and he kept a record of everything that happened to him." I skimmed through the pages, reading about strange noises, figures in the distance, people disappearing, only to return with no memory of what had happened. The further I read, the more I realized that the bridge had a long history of strange events, things that didn't make sense, things that couldn't be explained away by logic. "There's something about the land around that bridge," Tom said, his voice barely a whisper. "My grandfather was convinced that it wasn't just the bridge. It was the ground itself, something buried there. Something ancient." I closed the journal and looked at Tom, my mind racing. "So what do we do now?" "I don't know," he admitted. "But I think it's time we investigate. We need to go back there. Together." I didn't want to go back. I had already seen enough to know that something wasn't right. But the thought of leaving things unfinished, of not knowing what was truly going on, gnawed at me. That night, Tom and I drove out to the bridge. The darkness felt different this time, heavier somehow, as if it was closing in around us. As we approached the bridge, I felt the familiar sensation creep up my spine, the feeling that something was watching me, waiting. But I didn't stop this time. I couldn't. We parked just before the bridge and got out, flashlight beams cutting through the dense night. The air was thick, cold, and the trees around us stood still as though they were waiting for something to happen. "Stay close," Tom warned as he led the way toward the bridge. The wood creaked beneath our feet as we crossed, and the deeper we went, the stronger the sensation grew. I could feel the presence of something close, just beyond the edge of the shadows. My breath quickened, and my heart pounded in my chest. We reached the middle of the bridge, and I froze. Something moved in the distance, barely visible in the faint light of our flashlights. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then I saw it again, a figure standing at the far end of the bridge, watching us. "Do you see that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Tom didn't answer. Instead, he started walking toward it, his flashlight trained on the figure. I followed reluctantly, my steps slower, hesitant. As we got closer, the figure didn't move, didn't react to our presence. It just stood there, frozen in place. When we were almost directly in front of it, I reached out with my hand, and the air around me grew icy cold. I didn't touch it, but the moment I passed it, I heard a voice, faint and whispering in the back of my mind, as if it was calling to me from deep within the earth. "Leave," it said, a voice not entirely human, like the echo of something ancient and forgotten. I recoiled, my heart racing. But when I looked back, the figure was gone. Tom was already heading back to the car, his pace hurried. "Let's go," he urged, his voice strained. "It's not safe here." But I couldn't help but feel a strange compulsion to stay, to keep searching for answers. Something was here, something dark, and I couldn't leave until I understood what it was. The coldness in the air grew unbearable as I stood there, staring at the place where the figure had been moments ago. Tom's hurried footsteps had faded into the distance, and I was left standing on the bridge alone. My breath was shallow, my heart hammering in my chest. I had never felt so vulnerable, so exposed. Whatever it was that I had seen or thought I had seen was real, and it was more than just an unsettling image. It was a warning. I hesitated, torn between following Tom to the car and staying to confront whatever lingered in the darkness around me. Every instinct told me to leave, to run, and never look back, but my feet refused to move. The night seemed to hold its breath, and in that moment, everything felt suspended in time. The world around me felt unreal, as though the boundaries between what was real and what wasn't had begun to blur. "Tom," I called out, but my voice was weak, barely a whisper against the stillness of the night. I took a hesitant step forward, my flashlight sweeping across the bridge. But there was nothing, just shadows, silence. And then it happened. A loud crack echoed from behind me, like the snapping of a twig or a branch being broken underfoot. I whipped around, my heart leaping into my throat, but the bridge was still empty. I was alone, or so I thought. A figure stepped out from the darkness, tall and gaunt, its form barely visible against the backdrop of trees. It moved slowly, deliberately, its feet dragging across the old wood. My body froze, rooted to the spot as it came closer, closer still. For a moment, I thought it was Tom coming back to find me, but this was no ordinary man. The figure didn't look entirely human. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its skin pale and stretched tight over bone. Its eyes were hollow, dark voids that seemed to suck the light from around them. It was a being of the night, something beyond comprehension, something ancient and wrong. The figure stopped just a few feet away, its hollow eyes locking onto mine. A chill ran through me, and I felt as though the very air around me had thickened, suffocating me. I could hardly breathe, my chest constricting with the weight of fear. "Who? What are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. The figure tilted its head, its movements jerky, unnatural, as though it were struggling to comprehend me. Its mouth opened slightly, and I could feel the weight of its gaze on me, drawing me in, as though it were feeding off my fear. It spoke, but the words didn't come from its mouth. They seemed to echo in my mind, an intrusive whisper, chilling and foreign. "You shouldn't have come," it said. "This place belongs to us." My heart lurched in my chest as the weight of those words sank in. The bridge, the land, it wasn't just haunted. It was alive, and whatever had been lurking here for so long was finally revealing itself. It had been waiting for someone to uncover its presence, to step into its domain. And I had fallen right into its trap. Before it could touch me, a sudden gust of wind swept across the bridge, howling through the trees and forcing the figure back into the shadows. The light from my flashlight flickered, then died, leaving me in complete darkness. The silence that followed was deafening. My heartbeat echoed in my ears as I stood there, waiting, my body trembling. The air felt thick with tension, and for a moment, I thought it was over. Maybe it had retreated, or maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe it was all just my mind playing tricks on me, and I was still just standing on the bridge, alone, scared, and foolish. But then the air shifted. It grew colder, heavier, and I felt a presence, something behind me, something closing in fast. I spun around, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but there was nothing there. No figure, no movement. Then, a sound footsteps, slow and deliberate, just behind me. I turned again, but there was still nothing. "Tom?" I called out again, my voice trembling. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, trying to find any rational explanation. Maybe Tom had come back. Maybe he was playing some sick prank on me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't him. I could feel it. This wasn't a joke. It wasn't human. The footsteps grew louder, closer, as though whatever it was had taken another step forward, ready to strike. Suddenly, I heard Tom's voice, faint and distant, calling my name from the other side of the bridge. "Get out of there." His voice sounded panicked, urgent. But it was too late. The footsteps stopped, and in the silence that followed, the figure emerged from the shadows once again. It was closer now, just a few feet away. Its hollow eyes fixed on me, and I could see it more clearly than before. Its skin was stretched too tightly, its face an impossible mask of distorted features. Its mouth opened wider, revealing rows of jagged, sharp teeth. And then it spoke again, but this time, the words were not in my mind. They were in the air, reverberating in my ears. "You are mine," it hissed. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My body was frozen, my mind trapped in a haze of fear and panic. I was going to die here, on this bridge, with no one to hear my screams. The figure reached for me, its skeletal hand outstretched, and in that moment, everything seemed to stop. Time seemed to freeze. The world went silent, and all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. Then, just as its hand touched my shoulder, everything shattered. A deafening roar echoed through the air, and the figure screamed no, howled as it was pulled back into the shadows. It was as though something powerful and ancient had intervened, yanking it away from me with a force I couldn't understand. I stumbled backward, my legs weak, my head spinning. The world around me had become a blur, the ground beneath my feet shaky and unstable. And then, before I could react, everything went dark. I woke up on the ground, my head pounding as though it had been struck by something heavy. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as I slowly sat up, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The bridge was still there, the dark, silent river flowing beneath it, but everything felt wrong. The air was thick with an eerie heaviness, as if the very atmosphere had been stained by the presence that had haunted this place. I looked around in a daze, trying to orient myself, but there was no sign of Tom. For a moment, panic surged through me again. Had he made it out? Was he still here? Or was I the only one left? I stumbled to my feet, clutching the railing of the bridge for support. My fingers were numb, the cold biting into my skin, but it wasn't the chill that sent a shiver down my spine. It was the silence, the absolute, oppressive silence that hung in the air like a thick fog, drowning out all other sounds. No wind, no rustling of leaves, no signs of life. "Tom," I called again, my voice hoarse and weak. There was no answer, only the sound of my own voice bouncing back at me in the dead air. The absence of any response made my stomach churn. I took a few hesitant steps forward, my eyes scanning the darkness, but there was nothing. No figure in the shadows, no eerie footsteps, just the bridge, standing like an ancient sentinel in the night. "Tom?" I called once more, but this time the words felt hollow, swallowed by the darkness. The bridge felt deserted now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching, lurking just beyond my sight. It was then that I noticed the dirt path leading off the bridge, toward the trees that bordered the river. The path seemed to stretch out into the unknown, an invitation to something I wasn't sure I wanted to follow. But I had to know. I had to find Tom. I had to understand what had just happened. I moved slowly, cautiously, as I made my way along the path. The air grew heavier with each step, and the forest around me seemed to close in, the trees leaning in as though they were alive, watching my every movement. The sensation of being followed was overwhelming. I could feel eyes on my back, but when I turned around, there was nothing. I kept walking, the silence pressing in on me, until I saw something in the distance movement. My heart skipped a beat as I quickened my pace, but as I got closer, I realized it was just a bird, its wings fluttering in the darkness. Relief washed over me for a brief moment, but it didn't last long. I continued down the path, my mind racing, my thoughts a jumble of fear and confusion. What had I seen on the bridge? What had happened to Tom? And why did I still feel as though something was lurking just beyond my reach? Finally, I reached the edge of the forest. The path opened up to a small clearing, and there, standing in the middle of the clearing, was Tom. He was facing away from me, standing motionless. At first, I thought he was frozen in place, his body stiff and unmoving, but then I saw the way his shoulders trembled. It wasn't the cold that was making him shake. "Tom?" I called, my voice shaking. Are you okay?" He didn't respond. He didn't even turn around. I took another step toward him, but something stopped me. A feeling of dread washed over me, so intense that I felt my legs wobble beneath me. Something wasn't right. Something was wrong with him. "Tom!" I shouted again, this time with more force. "What's going on? What happened?" Slowly, ever so slowly, Tom turned his head. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and empty, like two black voids staring back at me. His face was pale, as though all the color had been drained from it. He didn't look like the Tom I knew. This wasn't the person I had come here with. "Tom, talk to me," I cried, reaching out to grab his arm, but he jerked away from my touch. "No." His voice was hoarse, ragged, like someone who hadn't spoken in days. "Get away from me. You don't understand." I stepped back, my mind racing. What was going on? Why was he acting like this? "Tom, what do you mean?" I asked, fear creeping into my voice. "What happened back on the bridge? What did you see?" Tom shook his head violently, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. You can't. You shouldn't have come here," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind that had started to pick up. I was confused, terrified, and desperate for answers. "What do you mean? What's going on? What happened to us?" His eyes flickered to the forest behind me, then back to me, and for a brief moment I saw a flicker of recognition in them. But it was gone just as quickly as it had come. He turned away from me again, his back to me as he began to walk toward the edge of the clearing. "Tom, please wait," I shouted, but he didn't listen. He was already too far ahead, his steps uneven, as though he was being pulled toward something, toward the darkness. I ran to catch up with him, but before I could reach him, the ground beneath me began to tremble. The earth shuddered, and a low growl echoed through the trees. It was a sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself, a sound that filled me with a primal sense of terror. I stopped in my tracks, my body frozen in place. The growl grew louder, and then I saw it something rising from the earth. A dark, swirling mass, like smoke or shadow, climbing its way up from the ground, twisting and contorting like something alive. Tom didn't seem to notice. He continued walking, his movements growing more erratic, as if he were being drawn into something beyond his control. The mass of darkness surged forward, surrounding him, pulling him in, and for a moment, I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. My mind raced, but nothing made sense. This wasn't just a haunted bridge. This was something far worse. This was something ancient, something that had been lying dormant for centuries, waiting for someone like us to awaken it. And now, it had Tom. As the mass of darkness continued to engulf Tom, I stood frozen, watching in disbelief. The growl, now louder and more guttural, reverberated through the ground beneath my feet. It was as if the entire forest was alive, its roots tangled in the pull of something ancient and unforgiving. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a heavy thud that echoed in my ears. "Tom!" I screamed again, but my voice was swallowed by the oppressive air. He was completely consumed now, the dark mass wrapping around him like a blanket of night. His body convulsed as though the thing that held him was squeezing the life out of him. I took a step forward, my legs shaking, but before I could take another, a voice deep, gravelly, and unmistakably malevolent whispered through the air. "Leave him." The words were simple, but they struck me like a blow to the chest. They were not a plea, not even a command. It was a statement. The voice knew exactly what was happening, and it knew that there was nothing I could do. But I didn't care. I couldn't. I had to save Tom. He was my friend, and I wasn't about to let this thing, whatever it was, take him without a fight. I ran toward him, my arms reaching out, my fingers desperate to grab hold of something, anything that could pull him free from the grip of the shadows. But as I got closer, the darkness seemed to grow thicker, more impenetrable. It reached out, tendrils curling like fingers, brushing against my skin with a cold that sent ice through my veins. Suddenly, I felt a pull on my own body. The ground beneath my feet seemed to shift, and I stumbled, caught by the force of something unseen. I fought against it, pushing back with all my strength, but the darkness was stronger, and it was everywhere now, surrounding me, pulling me toward the very heart of the forest. Tom, I shouted once more, my voice breaking, but there was no answer. No cry for help. No sound at all. I had to make a choice. Stay and fight, or run before I was swallowed whole by whatever evil this place harbored. I glanced at Tom, his figure barely visible through the swirling shadows, and I knew I had no chance of saving him, not here, not now. With a final, anguished cry, I turned and fled. My feet pounded against the earth, my breath ragged, as I ran back down the darkened path toward the bridge. The wind howled in my ears, drowning out everything else, and every step felt like an eternity. The forest seemed to close in around me, its trees bending and twisting in unnatural ways, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. I didn't stop. I couldn't. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to keep moving, to get as far away from the clearing as possible. I didn't know how long I ran, but by the time I reached the bridge, the first light of dawn was beginning to break through the trees. The eerie stillness had returned, but this time it felt different, quieter, as though the land itself was holding its breath. When I stepped onto the bridge, I paused, looking back over my shoulder. I half expected to see something or someone standing in the distance, watching me, but there was nothing. The forest was still, and the river below me flowed calmly, as if it hadn't just been the backdrop to something far darker. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and uneven, but there were no other sounds. No footsteps behind me, no shadows moving in the corners of my vision. With a deep breath, I walked to the edge of the bridge and looked down into the water. It was clear now, the surface unmarred by any ripples or disturbances. But somewhere deep within me, I knew what had happened on that bridge, in that forest, was not over. It was far from over. The thing that had taken Tom, whatever it was still out there, and it would find a way to come back. I don't know what happened to Tom after that night. I never went back to that bridge, never dared to return to the forest. It still haunts me every corner of the night, every shadow that stretches too long, every noise that sounds just a little too close. I know now that some things are better left alone, hidden away, and some places are better never discovered. But even now, when the wind howls through the trees or the moon casts long shadows on the ground, I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me, waiting. I don't know if it's the same thing that took Tom or something else entirely, but I do know one thing. There are places in this world where the veil between the living and the dead is thinner than we realize. And there are things that should never be disturbed. So, I warn you, if you ever find yourself near a bridge, deep in the woods, in the stillness of night, take care. The shadows are never as far away as they seem. And once you cross the threshold, there may be no turning back. It was a cool evening in early fall, and the coastal winds of the northern shore whispered through the jagged cliffs, carrying the salty scent of the sea. The air had the crispness of an impending change, a subtle shift from summer's warmth to the chill of winter. My name's Isaac, and I had just started my position as the sole keeper of a lighthouse on a small, isolated island off the coast. I had been on the job for a little over a month, and while the idea of being alone for extended periods sounded appealing, the reality was much more sobering. The lighthouse had been standing for decades, its towering structure a symbol of safety and warning for sailors who ventured through the treacherous waters. The island was small, not even a mile across, but it had an air of mystery that seemed to pulse beneath its rocky surface. There were no nearby towns, no other inhabitants. It was just me and the lighthouse. I had grown up hearing stories about the island, how it was once a haven for smugglers, how ships had vanished mysteriously over the centuries, but I paid little attention. Those were just stories, right? Nothing more than folklore. The first few days were peaceful. My daily routine was simple. I would climb the steep steps to the top of the lighthouse at dawn, checking the light, making sure it was operating perfectly. The mechanical systems were old but reliable, a testament to the craftsmanship of the past. After that, I'd inspect the grounds, checking the foundation of the lighthouse, maintaining the walls, and ensuring the signal was visible to passing ships. The evenings, however, were the best part of the day. The sun would dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the jagged rocks, and I'd sit on the small balcony, watching the waves crash against the island. There was something soothing about the endless rhythm of the sea, the way it seemed to cleanse the mind and quiet the soul. But that peace came with a price. The isolation started to gnaw at me after a while. Sure, the quiet was peaceful at first, but as days turned into weeks, the silence began to feel heavy. The only sounds were the cries of seabirds and the relentless crashing of the waves. It was during one of these moments, late one evening, when I first felt that something was wrong. Not just a feeling of loneliness, but an odd sense of presence. A shadow that lingered in the corner of my mind, one that didn't belong. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that it was just the isolation getting to me, that I was overthinking. After all, it wasn't as if I had any real company to keep me distracted. The small, rustic cottage where I stayed was not much to look at, but it had everything I needed. A simple kitchen, a living room with a worn couch, and a small bedroom with a window that overlooked the sea. I spent the evenings reading old books, maintaining the light, and occasionally trying to contact the mainland over the radio to check in. The days blurred together, one indistinguishable from the next. But then, something happened that would shatter that monotony and forever alter my perception of the island. One evening, as the fog rolled in from the sea, obscuring the coastline in a thick, ghostly blanket, I noticed something odd. From the balcony of the lighthouse, I could see the faint outline of a ship, its mast barely visible through the dense fog. Ships rarely came this close to the island, especially at night, given the dangerous rocks that jutted out from the shoreline. It was strange. Normally, ships would navigate well beyond the island, staying safely away from the jagged cliffs. But here it was, drifting closer and closer, its sails catching the dim light of the lighthouse. It wasn't a large ship, more of a schooner, but still, something didn't feel right. The ship seemed to glide unnaturally through the mist, almost as if it wasn't affected by the fog or the currents. The more I watched, the more uncomfortable I felt. It was as if the ship were waiting for something. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was heading straight for the rocks. Without thinking, I grabbed the emergency flare gun, just in case the ship was in trouble. I ran out to the rocky outcrop near the edge of the island, aiming the flare into the night sky. But the ship never responded. Instead, as the flare burned brightly in the air, the ship simply vanished into the fog. I stood there, staring into the thick white mist, heart pounding in my chest. The ship was gone, disappeared. I couldn't explain it. The fog was thick, yes, but it didn't just swallow things whole. I would have heard the sound of the ship's hull striking the rocks if it had crashed, yet there was nothing. I returned to the lighthouse, a chill creeping up my spine. That was when I first started to feel like something wasn't right with the island. The sudden disappearance of the ship, combined with the eerie silence that followed, left me shaken. I tried to push it out of my mind, telling myself that it was just the fog playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew there was something more. Something I couldn't see yet. The days passed in the usual routine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone on the island. At night, I would hear faint sounds scratching at the windows, soft thuds on the roof, and occasionally, the sound of footsteps echoing through the halls of the lighthouse. When I would check, there was no one there, just silence. It was driving me mad. But then, I began to notice something even stranger. Objects around the cottage would move. A chair would be in a different position than where I left it. A book would be open, pages turned, as if someone had been reading it. I would search the entire house, convinced I was being watched, but every time I found nothing. It wasn't just the cottage, though. The lighthouse itself seemed off. The lights would flicker, the gears would turn slowly, and sometimes the glass surrounding the light would fog up, even though the air was dry. And yet, despite all of this, I stayed. The contract was clear, and I had nowhere else to go. I had been hired to maintain the lighthouse for a full year, and leaving before that was not an option. I could feel myself slowly losing my grip on reality, trapped in the lighthouse with an unseen presence that I couldn't escape. Little did I know, this was only the beginning. The island was about to reveal its darkest secrets, and I would soon come to realize that I wasn't the only one living there. As the days turned into weeks, the tension built. I knew something was coming, something I couldn't explain. And the island, it had a way of revealing itself in its own time. The eerie fog never seemed to leave, and the strange occurrences were becoming more frequent. But that night, the night when everything would change, I had no idea how close I was to the edge of my sanity. There was something in the air, something waiting, and I would soon be forced to confront it. The night was particularly still when the first real sign hit me. It was around midnight, and I had just finished my usual routine. The fog outside the lighthouse had thickened again, turning the world into a ghostly blur. From the window, I could barely see the jagged rocks just below, the edges softened by the mist. It was the kind of night when the silence becomes oppressive, a heavy cloak that muffles the sound of your own thoughts. I was sitting in the small living room, the warmth of the stove providing the only comfort in the chill of the night. The low hum of the lighthouse's rotating light was a constant companion, a mechanical rhythm that kept me grounded. I had just begun to lose myself in the pages of an old book, one I had found buried in the corner of the lighthouse library, when it happened. It started with a faint noise, something I couldn't place at first, a soft scraping sound that seemed to come from outside. At first, I thought it might have been the wind tugging at the ropes of the lighthouse flag, or perhaps a seabird perched on the outer ledge. But as the sound continued, growing in intensity, I began to feel that familiar unease creeping up my spine. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a bird. It was something else. I set the book aside, my heartbeat quickening. There were no other people on the island. I was alone, and yet the sound persisted. It wasn't a consistent noise either. It came in short bursts, as if something or someone was scratching at the wooden walls of the lighthouse. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself that it could just be the building settling or the wind playing tricks. But the longer I listened, the more convinced I became that it was something much stranger. I rose from the couch, my hands trembling slightly as I crossed the room. I made my way to the small kitchen, checking the window to see if anything was out of the ordinary. The fog obscured my view of the landscape, but the sound kept coming, now unmistakably from the direction of the front door. My breath hitched as I reached for the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness as I approached the door. I opened it slowly, just enough to peer out into the gloom, but there was nothing there. No animal, no person, just the thick, suffocating fog. I stepped out onto the porch, the wooden boards creaking beneath my boots. I was feeling a strange mix of curiosity and dread, as if something was waiting for me just beyond the veil of mist. The silence was deafening. I stood there for a moment, trying to listen, trying to sense if something was out of place. But the longer I stood in the stillness, the more convinced I became that something was watching me. A sudden chill ran down my spine, and I quickly shut the door behind me. The feeling of being observed was overwhelming, and I couldn't shake it. I returned to the living room, my mind racing. I sat down on the couch again, trying to regain my composure, but the quiet was suffocating now. The noise had stopped, but it had left a lingering tension in the air that refused to dissipate. I tried to focus on the book again, but the words blurred together. My thoughts kept returning to that noise, that sensation of being watched. I couldn't explain it, but I knew something had changed. Something was different now. And it wasn't just the isolation. It was something deeper. As I sat there, trying to calm my nerves, I heard it again. A light tapping, like fingernails on wood. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. This time, it was coming from the wall just behind me. My pulse quickened. I whipped around, heart pounding in my chest. The room was empty, as it had been before. No one was there, and yet I could feel the weight of the air shifting, thick with something I couldn't put into words. The sound stopped almost as soon as I turned, but the unsettling feeling remained. I grabbed the flashlight once more, this time shining it in every corner of the room, searching for any sign of what might have caused the noise. Nothing. The room was as still as ever, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was hiding just out of sight. I checked the windows, locked the doors, and made sure everything was in its place, but the unease lingered. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the images in my mind. Every creak of the lighthouse, every gust of wind, every rustle of the fog outside sent my mind spinning. What had I heard? What had I felt? The sound was too real to ignore, yet there was no explanation for it. I didn't sleep much that night. I spent the hours tossing and turning, trying to rationalize what had happened. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the isolation was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew that I had felt something that I couldn't explain away. In the days that followed, the sense of unease only grew. The noises became more frequent, more deliberate. At first, I tried to ignore them, hoping they were just the sounds of an old building settling. But there were times when the scratching sound seemed to come from the walls themselves, as if something was trapped inside, trying to get out. I began to question my sanity. I hadn't seen anything, no ghosts, no creatures, no sign of anything unnatural, but the feeling of being watched was inescapable. It wasn't just the noises anymore. It was the sensation that something was lurking in the fog, waiting. And every night, when the darkness fell, I would hear the sound again, soft and insistent, as if the island itself was alive and aware of my presence. At one point, I even considered leaving. The thought of abandoning my post crossed my mind more than once. But I couldn't. The contract was clear, and leaving would be a breach of my responsibilities. So I stayed. I tried to ignore the strange events, telling myself that I was overreacting, that I was just lonely. But the more I stayed, the more convinced I became that something was wrong. The lighthouse, the island, there was something hidden beneath it all. Something that had been waiting for me to uncover. One afternoon, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, I decided to take a walk along the rocky shore to clear my mind. The wind had picked up, and the waves crashed violently against the rocks. I could barely hear myself think over the roar of the sea, but I didn't mind. It was better than sitting in that empty lighthouse, waiting for the next strange occurrence to happen. I walked for a while, my boots crunching on the gravel path, when I noticed something unusual on the ground, a small, weathered piece of wood, half buried in the sand. It was odd, I thought, considering there was no construction on the island. No one had been here for years, at least not since I had arrived. Curious, I bent down to pick it up. As I did, I noticed something else, a faint engraving on the wood, worn by time, but still legible. It was a symbol, one I didn't recognize. It was simple, but its meaning was unclear. Something about it felt wrong. I turned the piece of wood over in my hand, the unsettling feeling returning in full force. Was this a clue? Was it a message? Or was it just another trick of the island, feeding my growing paranoia? I couldn't be sure, but I knew I needed to find answers. The strange events were no longer just noises in the night. They were signs that something was coming, and I was about to find out just how far the island's secrets ran. Days began to blur together, each one indistinguishable from the last. The lighthouse was becoming a prison, a place where every creak and groan of the walls seemed to whisper a warning. The fog, which I had grown so accustomed to, was now a constant companion, never truly lifting during the day, always lingering like a shroud that kept the world at bay. It seemed to weigh on me, pressing in from all sides. The fog was oppressive, and with it came a constant sense of dread. The noises continued, subtle at first, soft scratches that I could have easily dismissed as wind or an animal, but over time they grew more deliberate, more frequent, more intense. I could hear them during the day now, too, faint tapping sounds that echoed from the walls, like someone or something was knocking at the door of my mind. The lighthouse was speaking to me in its own strange language, and I was beginning to understand that it wasn't trying to communicate. It was trying to warn me. It wasn't just the noises. The temperature inside the lighthouse had begun to fluctuate, despite the fact that I kept the stove running to fight off the chill. Some rooms felt unnaturally cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, while others felt oppressively warm, almost suffocating. The fluctuations were so erratic, I found myself checking the weather, wondering if it was something atmospheric, but the reports said nothing about unusual weather patterns. Just another strange occurrence to add to the list. I knew I couldn't keep ignoring it. Whatever was happening, it was escalating, and I couldn't stay in that isolated place, pretending it would all just go away. But what was it? The question gnawed at me, day and night. What was causing all of this? One evening, as I sat at the small wooden table in the kitchen, reading the latest logbooks from previous lighthouse keepers, I heard a noise that made my blood run cold. It wasn't the usual scraping sound, nor was it the tapping that had become so familiar. This time, it was something far worse. A loud, unmistakable thud. It came from above, from the tower itself, the place where the light rotated. My first instinct was to go outside and look to see if something had fallen or perhaps some animal had gotten trapped. But as I stood up and crossed the room, I froze. The thud repeated, but this time it was louder, more forceful. It sounded like something or someone was moving up there. I grabbed the flashlight, my hand shaking as I clicked it on. I had never felt fear like this before. The light was weak, barely cutting through the darkness as I ascended the spiral staircase that led up to the tower. The stairs creaked under my weight, the sound of my footsteps, the only thing that filled the silence, which seemed to stretch and stretch, becoming unbearable. When I reached the top, I was hit by a cold, damp air that seemed to seep out of the walls. I scanned the room with my flashlight, sweeping it over every corner. Nothing. Just the large rotating light in the center of the room, and the old machinery that powered it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I slowly moved toward the center of the room. I hadn't heard the thud again, but I felt something. It was in the air, thick and oppressive, pressing in on me. I was standing in the very heart of the lighthouse, and it felt as though something was breathing, just beyond the edge of the light. The beam from my flashlight flickered for a moment, casting long shadows against the walls, and I could have sworn I saw a figure move in the darkness. I stumbled back, nearly falling down the stairs as I made my way out of the tower. My heart raced in my chest, the adrenaline pumping through my veins. The air felt heavy with something I couldn't name, and I knew that I had seen something. But when I reached the bottom of the staircase, I dared not turn back. I didn't want to see whatever it was again. For the next few days, I tried to convince myself that it had been a trick of the light, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But the fear I felt was real. I couldn't shake it, no matter how hard I tried. The lighthouse was no longer a place of solitude. It had become a place of constant tension, as though something was waiting for me to slip up, to make a mistake. That night, I decided to investigate further. I had to know what was going on. I couldn't just keep hiding in fear. It was a mistake to wait this long. I ventured down to the lighthouse cellar, a dark, cold space I had avoided since my arrival. I hadn't even bothered to explore it, figuring it was just a storage area. But tonight, I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to understand what was happening to me. As I descended the narrow wooden steps into the cellar, the air grew colder. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, my flashlight illuminating the dusty shelves stacked with old supplies and tools. The room smelled musty, damp, like it hadn't been opened in years. The low hum of the lighthouse above me seemed to vibrate through the floorboards, a constant reminder that I was never truly alone. I checked the shelves one by one, picking up old, rusted tools, discarded books, and forgotten supplies. But there was nothing out of the ordinary until I reached the far corner of the room. There, in the shadows, I saw something unusual. A wooden chest. It was old, covered in layers of dust, and tucked away in a corner I had never bothered to investigate before. It looked out of place, as though it had been deliberately hidden. My curiosity piqued. I moved toward it, the flashlight beam trembling in my hand. I knelt down and carefully opened the chest, unsure of what I would find. Inside, there was nothing remarkable, just a collection of old papers, a few rusted tools, and something wrapped in a cloth. I unwrapped it slowly, revealing a strange, weathered stone. It was smooth to the touch, almost too smooth, and it had an engraving on it, a symbol I hadn't seen before. The same symbol that had been carved into the piece of wood I found on the shore. My heart raced. This wasn't a coincidence. Whatever this symbol meant, it was tied to everything that had been happening to me. The noise, the strange feelings, the cold spots in the lighthouse, all of it. I could feel my palms sweating as I turned the stone over in my hand, the weight of it heavy with meaning. It was almost as if the lighthouse had been waiting for me to find this, like it knew I would eventually discover its secret. Suddenly, I heard it again, the tapping sound. Faint at first, but unmistakable. It was coming from the walls. The same sound I had heard on that first night. I froze, clutching the stone to my chest as I listened. The tapping grew louder, faster, as if something or someone was trying to break through. My pulse quickened, and I found myself backing away from the chest, my mind racing with fear and confusion. What was happening? What had I uncovered? The air around me seemed to thicken, the room closing in, as if the walls themselves were alive. The tapping grew into something else, something more insistent, more deliberate. It wasn't just coming from the walls anymore. It was coming from all around me. I dropped the stone, its cold surface sliding from my hand as I bolted for the stairs. The sound of my feet pounding against the floor drowned out by the noise that surrounded me. Whatever was in that cellar, whatever was in that lighthouse, it was coming for me. As I scrambled back up the stairs, the light flickered again, and for a brief moment, I saw it just beyond the beam of the flashlight, something standing in the shadows, watching me. My breath caught in my throat, and my legs nearly gave out beneath me. I didn't stop running until I was safely back in the living room, the door locked behind me. The noises were gone now, but the fear remained. Whatever had been hiding in the walls of that lighthouse, whatever was lurking in the shadows, was still out there. And it wasn't finished with me yet. The night was colder than usual. The dampness of the sea air seemed to seep into my very bones, and as I stood by the small, cracked window in the living room, I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in from all sides. The fog had rolled in thicker than ever, wrapping the lighthouse in a shroud that made the world outside appear distant, as if I were in some kind of purgatory. I couldn't escape this place, not physically, not mentally. The walls had become my prison, and no matter how much I wished for it, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching me. I had tried everything to ignore the strange occurrences, to brush them off as a product of isolation, of being alone with nothing but the relentless roar of the sea. But the events had only grown more intense. The tapping, the cold spots, the shadows moving in the corners of my eyes, it all seemed too much. But tonight, I had decided enough was enough. I had to find the truth, no matter the cost. I had placed the stone from the cellar on the table beside me, the strange symbol still clearly etched into its surface. It felt almost alive, pulsing with a strange energy that I couldn't explain. My mind raced as I stared at it, trying to make sense of everything that had happened since that first night. The noises, the eerie sensations, the growing sense that I was no longer alone. Something was here with me. I just didn't know what it was. As I sat there in the silence, I felt a strange tension building in the air around me, a sense that something was about to happen. The light in the room flickered again, and the temperature dropped even further. I shivered, wrapping my arms around myself, but it wasn't just the cold that made my skin crawl. It was the feeling that something was moving in the darkness, just out of sight. Then, a sound. It came from above, from the tower, the same place I had heard the thud days ago. This time, it was louder. It wasn't a simple tap or scratch. It was a loud, violent banging, as if something was pounding against the walls. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, listening. The sound came again, and this time it was followed by a loud, grating screech, like metal scraping against stone. I stood up, my knees trembling, and grabbed the flashlight. The beam of light trembled in my hand as I moved toward the stairs. Every step felt heavier, as if the very air around me was thickening, pulling me downward into something I didn't understand. The sounds continued, growing louder and more desperate. Whatever was up there was trying to get out. As I reached the top of the stairs, I was met with an overwhelming sensation of dread. The room was darker than I had ever seen it before. The light above me flickered erratically, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. But it wasn't the shadows that caught my attention. It was the figure. For a moment, neither of us moved. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it, nor could I bring myself to speak. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating, as though the world had stopped turning, and we were the only two things left in it. I wanted to run, but my feet felt like they were frozen to the floor. The figure moved first. It took a slow step forward, its presence sending a wave of cold through the room. The air felt thick, and I could almost taste the metal tang of fear in the back of my throat. It was coming toward me, its movements unnatural, like something not quite human, but something that had once been. I stumbled back, my heart racing, the flashlight slipping from my grip and clattering to the floor. My breath came in ragged gasps as I tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go. The walls seemed to close in around me, and I felt a pressure on my chest, as if the very atmosphere were pressing against me, trying to suffocate me. The figure's hand reached out, its fingers long and bony, like the claws of some predatory creature. It stretched toward me, its fingers curling in the air as though it was about to grab me. I could feel its gaze on me, heavy and consuming. The fear inside me was so intense, I thought I might pass out. But then, before I could react, the figure stopped. It paused for a moment, its eyes still locked onto mine, and for a brief second, I thought I saw something else in its gaze. Something more than just emptiness. There was pain there, a deep, unbearable sorrow. A soul trapped in torment. It wasn't just a monster, it was a lost soul, a victim of something far worse than what I could comprehend. Then it spoke. The voice was low, guttural, like the sound of gravel scraping against stone. It was as though the words were being dragged from the depths of a forgotten place. "Leave," it said, the word barely audible, as though it was being dragged out of the very air itself. "Leave before it consumes you too." I couldn't understand. What did it mean? Leave? What was I supposed to leave? The lighthouse? The island? Was it warning me of something worse? Something I hadn't yet uncovered? The figure took another step toward me, its presence suffocating, and suddenly I felt the walls of the lighthouse shake. The light above me flickered violently, casting the room into utter darkness for a moment. When the light returned, the figure was gone, but the feeling of its presence remained, like a stain on the air. I stood frozen in place, my heart hammering in my chest. What had just happened? Had it been a hallucination? No, I knew it wasn't. It had been real. I had felt it. The room fell silent again, but the silence was no comfort. It was the kind of silence that screamed, that made the air feel charged with something malignant. I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to leave. But how? Where could I go? The fear that had been building inside me reached a breaking point. I had uncovered something dark, something ancient, and something that had been waiting for me. The lighthouse wasn't just a building. It was a prison, and I was trapped inside it with something that had been here long before me. I bolted for the door, not caring where I went, just needing to escape. But as I reached for the handle, I felt it. The cold hand on my shoulder, the one that made my spine snap straight and my blood freeze. I turned around, and there it was again, the figure, standing just inches from me, its hollow eyes staring into mine. And then it whispered again, its voice rasping and desperate. Leave, before it consumes you. I was no longer sure if I was running towards salvation or away from my own sanity. The moment my hand brushed against the cold brass of the door handle, a sense of urgency seized me. I had no idea what was waiting for me out there in the fog, but I knew I couldn't stay. I couldn't even bear to look back at the figure. All I could think about was getting out, escaping the nightmare that had ensnared me in that lighthouse. But as I reached for the door, something changed in the air. The weight of the silence grew, thick and oppressive. The sounds of the wind, the sea, even the creaking of the lighthouse's old bones, all of it seemed to disappear. The world felt as though it had paused, holding its breath in anticipation of something terrible. I stood there, frozen for a second, my hand trembling over the doorknob, and then I turned to face the darkness. For a moment, I thought I saw the figure again. Its form was just visible in the periphery of my vision, a shadow that shouldn't have been there. But I didn't dare to confront it. I couldn't. I yanked the door open and stepped into the night, the cold air slapping my face. My breath came in jagged gasps, each inhalation sharp as the fog closed in around me. The ground beneath my boots felt slippery, uneven, and for the first time since I arrived, I felt a rush of panic. The fog was too thick. I could barely see my hand in front of my face, let alone anything else. The lighthouse behind me, once a towering presence, was now just a vague silhouette, swallowed by the dense mist. The island was vast, and I had no way of knowing whether anyone would hear me if I shouted for help. I knew that my isolation had been the reason I hadn't been able to escape the horrors that had plagued me. But what had happened? Why had that figure come for me? What was it trying to tell me? I had no answers, just questions that gnawed at me, driving me forward, faster and faster. I moved until my legs burned and my lungs screamed for air, but still, the fog didn't lift. It was as if I were trapped in an endless void, a maze of mist and silence. There was no escape. And then I heard a sound, distant but unmistakable footsteps. Not mine. Someone else was out there following me. I could feel it in my bones. My blood ran cold. Panic surged through me, and I broke into a sprint, my heart hammering in my chest. My mind raced, questioning whether it was the figure or just my paranoia. But I didn't want to find out. I had to get away. I had to. The sound grew louder, closer, and I dared not turn around. But it was there, closer now. And with every step I took, the world seemed to close in tighter. The island was no longer just a place. It had become a labyrinth, each turn leading me deeper into the unknown. There was no way out. I ran, but no matter how far I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, hunted. The footsteps behind me matched my pace, never faltering, never getting closer. They seemed to mirror my movements, as though whatever was following me was toying with me, keeping me in its grasp. Just as I thought I could run no more, I reached a cliff. The ground beneath me sloped downward, and I realized I had come to the edge of the island. The sea churned below, dark and violent. I could hear the waves crashing against the rocks below, but they sounded muted, as though the fog had swallowed the sound. My mind screamed at me to turn around, to face whatever had been chasing me. But I couldn't. I couldn't bear it. I needed to leave. I needed to escape. But what was I running from? And then, in the haze of the fog, I saw something. A shadow. Not the figure, not the thing that had haunted me in the lighthouse, but a person. Or at least, I thought it was a person. Their outline was faint, barely visible through the mist, but there was something familiar about the way they moved. They weren't walking, they were gliding, like a phantom. I took a hesitant step forward, my body shaking with fear and exhaustion. The person, or the thing, took a step toward me as well. And then, before I knew it, the fog closed in around me completely. The world around me vanished, and the sea became a distant memory. I stumbled, my feet giving way beneath me, and I fell to the ground. The fog seemed to rise, swirling around me, choking the air from my lungs. Panic filled me once more, and I gasped for breath. I couldn't see. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't escape. But the figure was gone. The fog lifted, slowly, and the island returned to its quiet, desolate state. The fog that had consumed me seemed to thin, like the breath of the world had returned. I was alone. There were no footsteps, no sounds in the distance, just the cold, empty silence of the night. I didn't know what had happened. Had I just imagined the voice? Had I really been chased, or had it been some trick of the fog? My mind reeled as I lay there, trying to make sense of everything that had occurred. I couldn't stay on the island any longer. I knew I had to leave. The lighthouse, the fog, the voices, the shadows, they were too much. I had come here looking for peace, for solitude, but what I had found instead was something far worse. I didn't know what was real anymore, and I wasn't sure I ever would. Somehow, I managed to drag myself back toward the lighthouse, my body weak, my mind fractured. The door to the lighthouse creaked as I pushed it open, the familiar sight of the old tower standing before me. The place had changed, though. It no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a tomb, one that had claimed my sanity as its own. I didn't know if I would ever be able to leave the island, but I knew one thing for sure. The lighthouse had its secrets, and some of them would never be uncovered. Some things were meant to stay hidden. As I stood there, looking out into the fog, I realized that I hadn't just been running from the figure. I had been running from the truth because the truth was far worse than any ghost or shadow. As the days turned to weeks and the weeks to months, I found myself forever tethered to the memory of that lighthouse. I tried to move on, to return to normal life, but it was as though I carried a shadow with me wherever I went, a constant weight that I could never shake. The island, the fog, the haunting figure, it all followed me. It never left, not in my thoughts, not in my dreams. I began to wonder if perhaps I had never truly escaped at all. In the silence of my apartment, I would sometimes hear it, a distant echo, a whisper in the wind, the soft creak of an old floorboard. I would freeze, my breath caught in my throat, but when I turned around, the room was empty. Just the same sterile walls, the same quiet hum of the world moving on without me. But I knew, deep down, that something had changed. That place had changed me in ways I could never explain. No one would understand. No one could. I tried to tell people about what had happened, but how could I explain it? How could I describe the things I'd seen, the feelings I'd experienced, the fear that gripped me when I thought I was on the verge of losing my mind? I spoke to a few who seemed concerned, but their eyes would glaze over, and they would change the subject, as if my words were nothing more than a passing thought, a fleeting moment of delusion. They didn't know. They couldn't know. They hadn't felt the cold grip of the fog, the oppressive silence that swallowed the lighthouse whole. They hadn't heard the voice or seen the figure that followed me. It wasn't until months later that I received a letter postmarked from a distant place, one I couldn't immediately place. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but there was something strangely familiar about it all the same. I opened it slowly, the feeling of dread washing over me even before I had read the first line. You think you've escaped, but you haven't. You think the fog will leave you, but it won't. It's part of you now, and you are part of it. There is no way out. You are bound to it, just as I was. The letter was signed with a name I didn't recognize, but I knew instantly it was connected to the island. It had to be. I could feel it in my bones. The handwriting, the words, everything about it sent a chill down my spine. It was as though someone who had been there before was trying to warn me. But it was too late. The warning, if it had come, had arrived far too late. I tried to move on with my life, but something was always just beyond the edge of my thoughts, a presence I couldn't escape. I began to question everything: the past, the lighthouse, the figure, and even myself. Had I truly seen what I thought I saw? Was I simply a victim of my own paranoia? Or was there something truly malevolent lurking within that lighthouse? Something that I had only begun to understand. The doubts twisted in my mind, but there was one truth that remained undeniable. The lighthouse had claimed me. It had taken something deep within me, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, waiting. One night, as I sat alone in my apartment, I heard a soft tapping at my window. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, not daring to move, not daring to breathe. The sound came again, gentle but insistent. Slowly, carefully, I stood up and approached the window. My hand shook as I reached for the curtain, pulling it back just enough to peek outside. Nothing. The street was empty. The wind had picked up, sending leaves scattering across the pavement, but there was no one there. No shadow, no figure, nothing that could explain the sound I had heard. I closed the curtain, breathing a sigh of relief. But just as I turned away, I saw the faint outline of something moving in the reflection of the window. A shadow, just behind me, too close. I spun around, my heart racing, but once again, there was nothing. No figure, no presence, just the empty, quiet room I had grown so accustomed to. But it was there. I could feel it. It was as though the lighthouse, the fog, and the figure had followed me here, into my home, into my life. I was no longer safe, no longer free. I had become a part of it, and it would never let me go. In the years that followed, I tried everything I could think of to rid myself of the nightmare. I moved to different cities, changed my name, even sought therapy in an attempt to erase the past. But no matter what I did, the lighthouse remained, an indelible mark on my soul. It was as if the island had reached out to claim me, to drag me into its depths, and no matter where I went, it would always be there. Some days, I still hear the faintest whispers in the wind, the soft creak of an old floorboard, the sound of footsteps trailing behind me. And every time I do, I can't help but feel the weight of the fog closing in around me once more. I know now that I will never be free. The lighthouse has claimed me, and I am bound to it whether I am standing on that island or sitting in the comfort of my own home. It is with me always. And in the end, I have come to realize one simple truth. Some places are never meant to be escaped. Some memories are never meant to be forgotten. Some things are bound to us, for better or for worse, and no matter how hard we try to outrun them, they will always find a way to catch up. It was the fall of 2017 when I first moved into that apartment, a modest one-bedroom unit tucked away in a quiet building on the edge of town. It wasn't the fanciest place, but it was affordable and close enough to work that I wouldn't have to endure long commutes. After spending my last few years in a crammed shared apartment, I was excited to have a space to call my own. No more loud roommates, no more chaos, just peace, or so I thought. The building itself was old, the kind that felt like it had a history, one that hadn't quite faded away. The moment I stepped into the building's lobby, there was this almost eerie vibe to the place. The smell of old wood and faint mildew filled the air, and the lights flickered as if they had a mind of their own. It wasn't unsettling at first, just a little off. I brushed it off as an old building being, well, an old building. I remember vividly the first time I laid eyes on the apartment. The door creaked open to reveal a small but cozy space. The floors were hardwood, the walls were a faded beige, and the windows let in just enough light to make the place feel warm and inviting. It had a vintage charm to it, but not in a charming way, more like a relic from another time. It had been vacant for months before I moved in, according to the landlord, which made sense considering the strange vibe it gave off. Yet, I didn't let that stop me. After all, it was my new home, and I was determined to make it work. I didn't have much in the way of furniture, just a small couch, a bed, and a coffee table. Over the next few days, I made the place my own, adding personal touches to make it feel more like home. As I unpacked my things, I noticed small details that made the apartment feel lived in, even though it had been empty. The wallpaper in the hallway had faded in places, and the wooden floorboards creaked loudly whenever I walked across them. There was also the strange feeling of being watched, though I dismissed it as my imagination. My daily routine was simple. I worked from home, which gave me plenty of time to settle into my new space. The first week went by without incident. No strange noises, no flickering lights, just the quiet solitude I had been craving for so long. I would wake up, make coffee, settle in at my desk to work, and enjoy the peace of being alone in the apartment. On weekends, I would venture out to explore the local area or meet up with friends. Life was quiet, comfortable, and, most importantly, normal. Or at least, that's what I thought. As the weeks went by, something started to change. Little by little, I began noticing things that were just off. At first, it was small, just the occasional cold draft that would sweep through the apartment, even when the windows were closed. Or the way the kitchen lights would flicker when I was standing by the sink, as if someone was playing with the switch. I tried to brush these things off, chalking them up to the quirks of an old building, but the unease began to creep in. I wasn't alone in the building, of course. There were other tenants in the units around mine. Most of them kept to themselves, just like me. I would occasionally see them in the hallways, a brief nod or hello exchanged as we passed by. But there was one neighbor, an older man who lived on the floor above mine, who always seemed a little too interested in my life. He would often knock on my door, asking if I needed anything or if I was settling in okay. At first, I thought it was just his way of being friendly, but the more he came around, the more I felt a sense of discomfort. It wasn't just his constant presence that bothered me, it was his stories. He would tell me about the history of the building, how it had once been a grand hotel in the early 1900s before being converted into apartments. He would talk about the previous tenants and how some of them had left unexpectedly, almost as if they had vanished without a trace. His stories had a strange, almost haunting quality to them, and the more I heard, the more I began to question whether this building had a past that was best left untouched. But I didn't want to overthink things. I was alone, yes, but the apartment was still mine. I had worked hard to get to this point in my life, and I wasn't going to let strange occurrences drive me away. I convinced myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, that I was simply adjusting to a new place and its unfamiliar sounds. But that all changed the night I began hearing the footsteps. It started quietly, just the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway outside my door. At first, I thought it was just someone walking by. But then it became more frequent, and the steps started to sound heavier, as if someone was pacing back and forth outside my apartment. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the building settling or the neighbor above me. But the more I heard it, the more it unsettled me. The footsteps never seemed to stop. They would come at all hours of the night, echoing in the empty hallway outside my door. I tried to confront the neighbor about it, but every time I knocked on his door, he was either not home or too busy to talk. He would give me a strange look, almost as if he knew what I was asking, but didn't want to acknowledge it. I began to feel like I was going crazy, like I was the only one hearing the noises. The nights grew longer, and the footsteps grew louder. I could no longer deny that something was happening in that apartment building. It wasn't just the strange sounds or the odd atmosphere. It was the growing sense of dread that seemed to follow me everywhere I went. The more I tried to ignore it, the more it seemed to consume me. At that point, I realized something was wrong, but I didn't know what it was. It was as if the building itself was alive, and it was watching me, waiting for something. And the more I resisted, the more the strange occurrences escalated. But that would be just the beginning of what I would soon face. I remember the first time it happened. It was a Thursday night, the kind of quiet evening where nothing seemed out of place. I had spent the day working from home, as usual, and it had been a long one. The type of day where you're glued to your screen, barely noticing the time until it's dark outside. I'd barely taken a break, only stepping away for dinner and a quick walk around the block to clear my head. But by the time evening rolled around, I was exhausted. I settled onto the couch, planning to unwind with a book. The apartment was too quiet, if anything. The kind of silence that felt thick in the air, like something was waiting to happen. I brushed it off, trying to focus on the pages in front of me, but the feeling didn't go away. That's when I heard it. A soft scratching sound. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent. It came from the walls, as if something or someone was tapping on them. At first, I thought it might have been a rodent, a mouse, or something similar. I've heard that buildings like this can sometimes attract pests, especially if they're as old as mine. But when I listened more carefully, the scratching sound didn't seem random. It was rhythmic, almost deliberate. I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I strained my ears to listen. It wasn't just the walls anymore. It was coming from the floor, too. It was faint, like a soft tap-tap-tap against the hardwood, followed by a scraping sound. I stood up slowly, my heart beginning to race in my chest. I had never heard anything like it before. I made my way to the living room door and peered into the hallway. There was no one there. The hallway was dimly lit by the light from the windows, casting long shadows against the walls. It looked as empty as it always did, with nothing out of place. The door to the neighbor's apartment was closed. I had never seen him out at this time of night, so it was unlikely that it was him. But the scratching continued. I couldn't bring myself to open the door and check further. Something about it felt wrong, like I was being watched, like I wasn't supposed to investigate. I tried to shake it off. It was probably the building settling, I told myself. There was no way it could be anything else. But as the night wore on, the scratching grew louder, more pronounced. It was as if someone was making its way up the walls, dragging itself across the floor. I found myself clutching the edges of the couch, staring at the darkened hallway, too afraid to even move. Every time the noise stopped, I thought I could breathe again, but then it would start again, almost as if it had been waiting for me to let my guard down. I could hardly sleep that night. I eventually turned on the TV to drown out the noises, but it didn't work. I kept hearing them in the background, soft taps, faint scratches, and the distant sound of something dragging across the floor. At some point, exhaustion overtook me, and I finally fell asleep, though it was a restless one. The next morning, I was groggy but determined to forget about what had happened. I told myself that it was just my imagination running wild. I was adjusting to living alone, and perhaps the isolation was getting to me. Nothing more, nothing less. But that day, something happened that made me rethink my entire perspective on the apartment. I had left the apartment to run some errands, grabbing coffee and picking up groceries. I was out for a few hours, and when I returned, I noticed something strange. The door to my apartment was slightly ajar, just enough to make me question if I had forgotten to close it properly before I left. I didn't remember leaving it open, but I figured it was possible after all. I'd been in a rush that morning. What I didn't expect was the feeling that washed over me when I stepped inside. The air felt thick, as if something had changed in the time I had been gone. I couldn't quite place it, but it was like the room had taken on a new, heavier energy. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't a foul odor, but a strange, metallic scent that hung in the air, almost like old coins. It was subtle at first, but it became more pronounced the longer I stood there. I walked through the apartment, checking the windows to make sure everything was secure. It didn't seem like anyone had broken in, but the feeling of unease remained. I shrugged it off. It was probably nothing. Maybe a neighbor had accidentally left my door slightly open when they came by, though I couldn't imagine why. I didn't interact much with them, but it was possible. But there was something in the back of my mind that nagged at me, telling me that I was missing something. Later that night, as I was getting ready to go to bed, I decided to check the hallway outside again. It was quiet, just like before, but the scratching sounds had stopped. I was almost relieved, thinking that maybe it had just been a one-off incident. But as I walked down the hallway, a strange noise caught my attention, a soft tapping on the floor, like something had been dragged across the wood. It came from the very end of the hallway, near the stairs. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no one in sight. The building was still, the kind of silence that felt almost too perfect. I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary, yet the feeling that something was wrong hung over me like a dark cloud. Then, out of nowhere, the light above me flickered, just for a second, but it was enough to make me flinch. I quickly turned and rushed back into my apartment, locking the door behind me. I stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, trying to shake the feeling of dread that had crept up on me. I decided I wouldn't let it get to me. I would just go to bed and get some sleep. But that night, sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing noises, footsteps, scraping sounds, something dragging along the floor. It felt like the apartment was alive, like it was trying to communicate with me in some way. The noises were getting closer, and the air felt heavier, like something was right there with me in the dark. That night was the first time I truly felt like I wasn't alone in that apartment. There was someone else there, and I had no idea who or what it was. I wasn't sure if I should be afraid, but deep down, I knew that whatever was happening wasn't normal. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, clutching the blankets and hoping for morning to come. When it finally did, I couldn't shake the feeling that things had changed, that my life in that apartment had taken a turn, and there was no going back. The events that followed that night seemed almost as if they were carefully orchestrated, each one more unnerving than the last. The silence that had once been comforting in my apartment began to feel like a trap, a waiting game, where something unseen was always on the edge of my perception, just out of sight. It started small, almost too small to notice at first. At night, I would hear the faintest of tapping sounds again, coming from the walls, the floorboards, or sometimes even the ceiling. It wasn't constant, just intermittent, like someone tapping a finger or the faint shuffle of footsteps on a hardwood floor. But it was always there, and as soon as I would begin to relax, the sound would return, like a reminder that something was wrong. I tried to ignore it. I tried telling myself it was just the old apartment settling, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. The noises seemed too deliberate, too consistent to be random. And then, one evening, it happened again, but this time, it wasn't just tapping. I was sitting in my living room, reading, trying to forget the previous night's unsettling noises. The light in the room flickered briefly, but I shrugged it off. The building was old, after all, and flickering lights were a common issue. But then the lights went out completely. Just as I stood up to check the fuse box, I heard it loud, unmistakable, and right behind me a soft, guttural breath. It was so close that I could feel the warmth of it on the back of my neck. I spun around, my heart racing in my chest. There was no one there. The room was empty, and the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. But my skin crawled, and the oppressive sense of something being right there watching, waiting, was palpable. I turned on my phone's flashlight, scanning the room as if expecting to find something lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing. Nothing except the suffocating silence. I sat back down, trying to steady my breath. Was I losing my mind? I had no explanation for what had just happened. And as if to mock me, the lights flickered back on, illuminating the apartment in harsh, fluorescent light. I couldn't escape the feeling that something had just brushed against me, something invisible and waiting to make itself known. The days that followed became a blur of strange occurrences. The lights flickered on and off regularly, almost as if they were reacting to my emotions. When I felt calm, they would stay on. When I was anxious, they would flicker, sometimes even going completely out for minutes at a time. It wasn't just the lights, though. The temperature in the apartment started fluctuating wildly. One moment, it would be unbearably hot, the next, frigid. I found myself wrapping up in a blanket one evening, only to break into a sweat the next. I was scared. I couldn't pretend anymore that these things were just coincidences. Something was happening in that apartment. Something beyond my control. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I was being watched, as though eyes were boring into my very soul. I began to avoid looking at mirrors, avoiding any reflective surface, because I couldn't shake the feeling that something would appear in them when I wasn't looking. The unease was overwhelming. But it wasn't just at night. The strange events started to occur during the day, too. I'd come home from work, tired but eager to relax, only to find that things had moved. My kitchen utensils, usually neatly arranged, were now scattered across the countertop. A glass that I distinctly remembered placing on the shelf was now on the floor, shattered. My books, carefully organized on the shelf, would be pulled out of alignment, as if someone had been rummaging through them. I started to question my own sanity. I'd check the locks on my doors and windows, only to find them secure. Nothing in the apartment seemed out of place, other than the occasional oddity. But I couldn't deny what I was experiencing. I was certain that someone or something was messing with me. The noise became louder. The tapping on the walls turned into knocks, sharp, loud knocks that echoed through the apartment like a hammer pounding against the walls. They didn't seem to come from any particular place. One night, I would hear them from the hallway. The next, they would be coming from inside the apartment itself. The knock, knock, knock would begin, then stop suddenly, only to be replaced by a dragging sound, something heavy scraping across the floor. I would leap to my feet, turning on every light in the apartment, only to find the rooms empty, the apartment still as a grave. I was losing my grip on reality. Each new event seemed to pull me deeper into a world I couldn't control, a world where logic and reason held no sway. It wasn't just the noises now. I would sometimes wake in the middle of the night, heart racing, convinced that I had heard my name being called. But when I would open my eyes, there was no one there, just the darkness of my apartment pressing in, thick and suffocating. It was on one such night, after yet another sleepless evening, that I decided I had had enough. I couldn't continue living like this. I had to figure out what was going on, what was happening in my apartment. It wasn't just my mind playing tricks. This felt real, and I needed answers. I began to investigate. The first thing I did was check the building's history. I went down to the leasing office and asked if they had any information on past tenants, previous owners, or any strange events that had occurred. The office staff seemed uncomfortable with my questions, almost as if they were trying to avoid the topic altogether. But one older woman, who had worked there for years, gave me a strange look when I asked about the apartment's past. She seemed hesitant, as if she were debating whether or not to tell me something. After a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice low and almost whispered. There's been incidents, yes, strange things happening in that apartment. But it's been a long time since anyone's had issues. You shouldn't worry about it. She didn't offer any details, and when I pressed her, she shut down completely. I left the office feeling more unsettled than ever. The fact that there had been incidents in the past made everything feel so much worse. It wasn't just me. Something was wrong with that place. I could feel it in every fiber of my being. I returned to the apartment that evening, determined to confront whatever was haunting it. I began moving furniture around, searching for any hidden compartments, any signs of something that didn't belong. I found nothing. The apartment was just as it had always been, old, but well maintained. But as I was moving a heavy bookshelf, a small object fell to the floor. It was a key, a small old-fashioned key, worn with age. It didn't look like anything from the apartment. There were no locks that it could fit. I held it in my hand, staring at it. Something about it felt off. It was as if it didn't belong there. I wasn't sure where it had come from, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was significant. Maybe it was a key to something I hadn't found yet. Or maybe it was a message or a clue from whatever presence had been haunting me. With my heart pounding in my chest, I placed the key in my pocket and decided to get some answers. I wasn't going to let fear control me anymore. But as I stood up to leave, the temperature in the room suddenly dropped. I felt it, the sharp, biting cold, as though the air itself had shifted. And in that cold, I heard it again, the soft scraping sound, just behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Nothing at all. But I knew then something was waiting for me. Something old, something that had been there long before I ever moved in. And I had just uncovered its first clue. That night, the air felt different, thick, like it was charged with something electric, something alive. I could feel it pressing against my skin, making each breath feel labored, heavy. My mind was racing, each thought tangled in the dread that had slowly taken hold of me since the first unsettling noise. I couldn't escape it now. The strange occurrences had reached their peak, and something inside me told me that I was no longer just a passive observer. I was a part of whatever was happening, whether I liked it or not. It was just past midnight when the knocking started. But this time, it wasn't coming from the walls or the floor or the ceiling. This time, the sound came from the door. A loud, deliberate thud, like someone was knocking with force, wanting to be heard. I froze, my heart slamming against my chest. I had become so accustomed to the sounds at night, so conditioned to the eerie noises that had plagued me for weeks. But this was different. This wasn't the usual tapping or scraping. This was something demanding my attention. When I reached the door, the knocking stopped. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the door handle, as if waiting for it to turn on its own. But nothing happened. The apartment fell into a tense, unnatural silence. It was as if everything had gone still, frozen, suspended in time. I knew, deep down, that whatever was on the other side of that door wasn't something I was prepared to face. But I had to open it. I had to see. I reached for the handle and turned it slowly, my fingers trembling uncontrollably. As the door creaked open, a wave of cold air rushed past me, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I stepped back, half expecting to see something or someone standing in the hallway. But there was nothing, only darkness. I stepped outside cautiously, my heart hammering in my chest. The hallway was just as empty as it had always been, no sign of life. But then my gaze landed on something in the corner of the hallway, shadow, flickering, moving, like it was shifting with every blink of my eyes. I couldn't make out any details, only the movement of something large, something that didn't belong. Before I could react, the temperature around me dropped even further. My breath became visible, misting in the air like I was standing in the middle of winter. The cold was unbearable, the kind that seeped into your bones and froze you from the inside out. I could feel my skin tightening, my teeth chattering, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, my gaze locked onto the shadow, which seemed to grow larger with each passing second. And then I saw it. The figure stepped forward into the dim light, revealing its shape. It was taller than any person should have been, and its body was contorted in unnatural angles. It didn't look like a person at all. Its limbs were long, far too long, and its skin was pale, almost translucent, like it had never seen the light of day. Its face, if you could call it a face, was an empty, featureless void. No eyes, no mouth, just a smooth, skin-like surface where there should have been something human. But the worst part, the part that made my blood run cold, was the feeling of dread that washed over me. A suffocating, overwhelming presence that I could almost feel pressing against my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But my body wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, staring at the creature that had materialized from the darkness. And in that moment, I knew deep down that this wasn't some figment of my imagination. This was real. This thing, whatever it was, had been waiting for me to open the door, to come face to face with it. It took a step forward, its long limbs dragging along the floor with an unsettling, slow grace. My heart pounded so loudly in my ears that I could barely hear the dragging sound anymore. But I felt the weight of its presence, felt the hunger in the air. It was coming for me. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. For a moment, everything was still. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. I could hear the distant hum of the building's ventilation system, the faint creak of the old apartment complex settling, but that was it. No footsteps, no movement. It was as if the creature was waiting for something, waiting for me to do something. I backed away slowly, my body trembling violently. I needed to get away, to escape. But my legs felt like lead, my feet like they were glued to the floor. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to flee, but I couldn't move fast enough. And then I heard a voice. It wasn't a voice in the traditional sense. It was more like a thought that invaded my mind, a whisper that didn't come from anywhere but inside my own head. "You shouldn't have opened the door." I gasped, my body freezing at the sound of it. The voice was cold, emotionless, like the thing had no interest in my fear, only in its own twisted amusement. The words echoed in my skull, reverberating through every fiber of my being, making it impossible to focus on anything else. I looked up at the creature once more. It was closer now, its faceless gaze fixed on me, and I could feel it was drawing closer to me, its presence overwhelming everything else in the hallway. The very air around me seemed to warp, as if reality itself was bending under its power. I had no more fight left in me, no more will to resist. I felt like I was suffocating, like the weight of the world was bearing down on me, threatening to crush me beneath it. But then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the creature stopped. It didn't move forward, didn't come any closer. Instead, it seemed to retreat, drawing back into the shadows from which it had emerged. Slowly, deliberately, it faded from view, its form dissolving into the darkness, leaving nothing behind but an oppressive silence. For a moment, I stood there, too stunned to move, my mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. Had it been real? Was I dreaming? Or had I lost my mind? But when I glanced around the hallway once more, I saw the key I had found earlier, lying on the floor, shining faintly in the dim light. I picked it up, my hands shaking, and without thinking, I turned back to my apartment. The door slammed shut behind me as I stumbled inside, heart still racing, breath coming in shallow gasps. I locked the door behind me, pressing my back against it, still trembling from the encounter. But even as I stood there, trying to calm my breath, I knew this wasn't over. Whatever I had just faced was still out there, and it would come for me again. It always would. I stood there for what felt like hours, my back pressed against the door, eyes darting around the room, expecting anything to move. The silence that followed the encounter with the creature was suffocating, a quiet that felt unnatural, almost as if the world itself was holding its breath. My hands were still trembling, a dull ache coursing through my body, but my mind was in a state of pure chaos. What had I just seen? What was that thing, and why had it targeted me? I tried to make sense of everything, the events, the strange noises, the feeling that something was watching me long before I had opened that door. The thoughts spun in circles, looping back on themselves, never arriving at a clear answer. The logical part of my mind screamed that I was losing touch with reality, that I had somehow fallen into a nightmare I couldn't wake from. But deep down, I knew what had happened was real. I wasn't imagining things. And that terrified me more than anything else. I knew I couldn't stay in this apartment anymore. It was no longer just a place to rest, a space I had made my own. It had become a prison, a place of unimaginable fear. And the thing that had appeared in the hallway, it wasn't done with me. I could feel it in my bones, a knowing certainty that whatever it was, it would come back. It had already shown me its power, its reach. I had opened the door, and I couldn't just pretend like nothing had happened. Without thinking, I grabbed my jacket and my phone, rushed to the small closet near the front door, and threw a few essential items into a bag. I was moving on autopilot, driven by a single, overwhelming instinct. I needed to leave. I couldn't stay here. Not tonight. Not with that thing still out there, lingering in the shadows. My heart was pounding as I pulled open the door, stepping into the hallway once more. The air felt thick, like something was pressing down on me, but there was no sign of the creature. The hall was silent, empty, just as it had been earlier. But I knew better than to trust it. It was a false sense of security, a lull before the storm. I made my way toward the stairs, moving quickly, urgently, my footsteps echoing in the otherwise quiet building. I reached the stairwell, almost stumbling down the steps as I descended to the ground floor. My mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened, but all I could focus on was the overwhelming need to get out of the apartment building, to put distance between myself and whatever it was that had followed me. As I stepped outside into the cool night air, a small wave of relief washed over me. The streets were empty, the lights of the city glowing in the distance. I wasn't safe, yet not by any means, but at least I was away from the apartment, away from that oppressive, suffocating atmosphere that had gripped me for so long. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the air, trying to calm my racing thoughts. But even as I stood there, trying to regain some semblance of control, I knew it wasn't over. The creature hadn't followed me outside, but I could still feel its presence, like a shadow that refused to let me go. I had no idea what it was, what it wanted, or why it had come after me. But I had a sinking feeling that this was just the beginning. I found a hotel nearby, checked in under a different name, and collapsed into the bed, too exhausted to think. I didn't sleep though. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the creature's faceless, inhuman form, the coldness that had radiated from it, the hollow emptiness of its gaze. I couldn't escape it, not even in my dreams. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, even from miles away. Every time I passed an alley, every time I heard a noise in the distance, my heart would race, my body would tense. Was it the creature, the thing that had haunted me for weeks? Or was it just my mind, trying to make sense of what had happened? The uncertainty was almost worse than the fear itself. In the days that followed, I tried to carry on with my life, to pretend like everything was normal. I found a new place to stay, a small apartment on the other side of town, far from the building that had been my prison. But even here, I couldn't escape the sense of unease that had taken root in me. The silence felt too heavy, the shadows too long. I kept thinking about that key, the one I had found in the hallway, the one that had seemed so out of place. What was it for? Why had I found it? I never told anyone about it, never went back to the building to see if it had any connection to the creature, but the question lingered, gnawing at me. I couldn't help but wonder if it was a clue, if it was the key to understanding everything that had happened. But every time I thought about going back, something inside me screamed to stay away. The fear, the dread that had filled me that night was still fresh in my mind. I couldn't go back. Not to that building, not to that place of darkness. So I moved on. I tried to forget. I focused on my new apartment, my new life. But the memories were always there, lurking in the back of my mind, never fully leaving me. And sometimes, when the nights were quiet, I would hear a faint knocking sound, echoing through the darkness. But when I opened my eyes, the room was empty, and I was left alone, trapped in a silence that was just as suffocating as the one that had followed me all those weeks before. I never spoke to anyone about what happened, about the creature, or the key, or the fear that still haunted me. Who would believe me? Who would understand? But I know one thing for certain. Whatever that thing was, it's still out there, waiting, watching, and I have no doubt that one day it will find me again. The question is, will I be ready? It's been months since I left that apartment, and as I sit here, reflecting on everything that happened, I can't help but feel like I'm still running from it. The memories are there, buried deep in my mind, but the fear, that gnawing, suffocating fear, it's still with me, lurking in the shadows, just waiting for the moment when I'll let my guard down. I've moved on, or at least, I try to. I don't spend my nights thinking about the creature, the hallway, or the empty stare that haunted me for so long. I try not to let it control me. But every once in a while, I'll hear something creak in the floorboards, the sound of a door slowly opening, and my heart will skip a beat. It's like my body remembers, even when my mind wants to forget. I left that apartment for good, but I know now that the true terror wasn't the creature or the darkness I faced that night. The real terror is the way it changed me, the way it made me question everything I thought I knew. And it's not something you can ever fully leave behind. Every corner I turn, every place I go, I wonder if I'm safe. I wonder if it's watching me again, waiting for the right moment to strike. I can't escape the feeling that no matter where I go, it's always there, lurking just out of sight. I can't tell you how many times I've had to fight the urge to look over my shoulder, to double check that no one is following me, no one is there, waiting. I can't bring myself to throw it away, though I'm not sure why. It feels like a tether to that world, that nightmare I barely survived. Maybe it's fear that keeps me from getting rid of it. Or maybe it's hope that someday I'll finally be able to make sense of it all, to understand why I was chosen, why that thing came after me. And when it's all over, when I finally have the answers, maybe I'll be able to sleep soundly again, free from the fear that's clung to me all these months. But right now, that feels impossible. Every time I close my eyes, I see the thing in the hallway, its cold eyes, its twisted form. And I know that no matter how much time passes, no matter how far I run, I'll never escape it. I'll never escape the fact that whatever I encountered in that apartment, whatever darkness I uncovered, is still out there. And maybe, just maybe, it's waiting for me to return.